Tales from the Break Room is a viewer submission podcast. If you want us to narrate your scariest work story, send it to us at darkstories.org. Also, go to eeriecast.store to buy a shirt or a mug or something, 'cause I ain't going through withdrawals again. Thank you. I know, I'm sorry. It's another compilation, but I've been so busy lately. Turns off Xbox, shoves plate of Mama's tendies under the couch. Now, while I get back to the grind, enjoy this compilation of scary hospital stories perfect for a sick day. Just remember, if you're too sick, you'll have to go to the hospital yourself, and you might just have your own encounter of pure terror. Now, let's begin. Andrea, from Mythology Loves Horror. My fiancé, H, once shared a chilling memory with me from a time when his father was in the hospital. Here's the story, which happened back in 2014. Throughout my life, I've spent many days and nights in the hospital, most of which I spent curled up in a chair next to my dad during his multiple extended stays. His latest visit was the worst one of the lot, and it was caused by him knocking his head against the bathroom sink and going into a series of seizures. The day the accident happened, I was walking my dog Ozzy, and he began tugging frantically against the leash in a way I've never seen. Having a hunch about why he was doing this, I let him lead me back toward the house without argument. The house was overly quiet, and when I called to my dad, the sound seemed to echo eerily. As I made my way down the hallway to where my dad's room was, but I didn't find him there, so I checked the bathroom, only to find a horrific sight. My father lay on the bathroom floor, his eyes rolled back in his skull, and his skin an unnatural shade of blue. He was lying in a pool of red. At the sight of this, I panicked, but my medical training kicked in. I checked his pulse, then rolled him onto his side, like I'd been taught to by his doctors. I supported his head with towels, and I used a compression technique on the gash in his skull as I dialed 911. During the ambulance ride, he went into an additional 13 seizures, and it took the doctors putting him into a medically induced coma for the seizures to finally stop. A few nights after the incident, I was sleeping next to his bed in the ICU when I woke from a cold breeze. I looked over to my dad, who was sitting upright in his bed with his eyes rolled back. He was attached to tubes and IVs, and I could tell that he still hadn't woken from the coma. Without even taking a breath, he whispered to me in a cold, hard voice, "I don't want you to see me like this." His back slumped into the pillows, and I sat there in shock. At this point, I was already on edge. How had he been able to speak? I needed to clear my mind and talk to his neurologist if I could find him there that late. So I went for a walk around the dimly lit hospital. Every shadow seemed to turn towards me in the near-silent building. There were no doctors running around tonight, and there seemed to be a lack of other staff. Due to the immense size of the hospital, I ended up getting lost down a long hallway, so I decided to try heading back the way I came. When I was about halfway down one of the many corridors, I saw a woman in a hospital gown. Something was odd about her, though. She appeared almost transparent. At first, I thought it was from my lack of sleep, but upon reaching her, she simply disappeared. There were no rooms or other hallways nearby that she could have gone down. I shook my head. I must be exhausted, I told myself, and I kept making my way back to my dad's room. About 5 minutes later, I saw the same woman down another hallway, so I decided that she must be real, and I started to follow her to make sure she was okay. Somehow, she looked even more pale this time around, and I was worried that she might be in need of more medical attention. 3 more hallways passed, and then I saw her walk into a room in a part of the hospital that I hadn't seen before. I opened the door slowly. The figure was standing in the middle of the room with her back to me. As she turned to face me, I almost screamed. Where she could have had eyes, there were just voids, empty holes. Not even pieces of her eyes remained. Her mouth was sewn shut, and her expression was inhumanly blank. I ran from the room in terror, not stopping my frantic dash until I recognized where I was again. I'd finally found my dad's room, and I'd never felt more relieved. After the encounter, I headed back to my chair to try to get some rest. I kept telling myself that the whole thing was due to the extreme stress I was under, coupled with a lack of sleep from the last few days. I finally managed to drift off, only to wake up from night terrors a few hours later. I got up to use the bathroom and take a shower, and when I went to brush my teeth, there were 5 words written in the steam that had coated the mirror. "Why did you leave me?" As I turned around, I saw a piece of white hospital gown in my peripheral vision. I assumed for a moment that my dad had gotten out of bed. I excitedly went to hug him, but I realized that it was the same terrifying figure from before, standing over my dad with as much of a smile as she could muster through stitched lips. She touched his forehead as she whispered something to him. I remember being so scared that I simply blacked out, but I woke up back in my chair. I could not feel any bad energy anymore. I looked at my dad, and he looked visibly less pale than before. 2 days later, my dad came out of the coma. At first, he didn't understand where he was or who anyone else was. The doctors were amazed that he was awake at all, though, as they had predicted that he may well die while in that coma. The next few days were rough as my dad's memory slowly returned, and I forgot all about that apparition. A few days later, I was home alone. I needed a short break from helping my dad reintegrate his memories. I knew he'd be fine for a few hours under the care of several kind staff members at the nursing home nearby. I was getting clean clothes from my room when I saw a note on my pillow. I blinked at it in confusion a few times, then read it thoroughly before dropping it in shock. I hadn't recognized the handwriting, but the paper had the hospital's name printed at the top. "Even though you didn't help me, you're welcome, Andrea." To this day, H, 9 years after his ghostly encounter, still has night terrors about meeting such a horrifying entity. Sometimes he wakes up in the night screaming, though he never seems to remember doing this, and I can't help but wonder if Andrea is punishing him. He's watching. From Abby. My father was a godly man and was very much a skeptic of anything paranormal. I know some of you might think that's a contradiction. When checked into the hospital, he began seeing apparitions in the corner of his room, and shortly after, he passed away. He had been admitted into the hospital with some symptoms of pneumonia and signs of a heart attack. I visited him the morning after he was transported to a larger, more adequate hospital, about an hour or so away from our home. At the time, nothing was abnormal. He was a regular, stable patient. The next couple of days went smoothly too. A few mornings after he was checked into the hospital, I heard my aunt on the phone with my mother. I stayed with her because my mother practically lived in the hospital while my father was there. She was saying things like, "Is he stable now? Thank the Lord he's all right." When I got up to see what was going on, my aunt told me that my father had another heart attack, but he's all right for the moment. This type of thing happened every now and again. He would become stable, then his vitals would plummet, then he'd go back to being stable again. This all happened over the course of 15 days. Around the 11th or so day, every one of my aunts from my father's side decided to take a trip down to see him, just in case something happened, as he wasn't exactly healthy anymore. I went with them. We all visited and talked for a bit before deciding to go down to the cafeteria to eat. This was when my mother informed us all of what was going on in my father's room. She said that he would periodically ask about the person in the corner, and every time my mother would answer with, "There's no one there, Ron," to which he'd always point to the corner of the room and insist that someone was standing there, watching them. My aunts, who were all religious, believed it to be angels trying to protect them. On the other hand, I believed it was something more sinister, given the state he was currently in. It didn't help that they referred to this wing of the hospital as the death wing, and if you were sent there, it meant you had little to no chance of survival. After we ate, we went back to my father's room. I remember sitting in the chair beside his bed and quietly cursing at whatever was in his room. I told them to leave him alone, and I'll never forget what happened after. Before we all left, we all hovered around my father's bed to say goodbye for the day. A couple of minutes in, I felt a cold draft behind me. A few seconds after I felt it, my father looked up at me and pointed. I noticed that he wasn't looking directly at me, but instead, it was as if he was looking over the top of or behind me, where no one was standing. He was trying to say something, but didn't have the strength to. In my eyes, it looked like he was saying no, but I can't be certain. Either way, he just kept staring at me until I left the room. A few days later, my father passed away. I was there when it happened. He was frothing at the mouth when he died, and he acted like he did when he had the other heart attacks. The thing that freaks me out most was that his death certificate says nothing about another heart attack. So I don't truly know what caused his death. Maybe it was his illness, maybe it was the things he was seeing, or maybe a combination of both. But I can't help but wonder if I will see them too one day. The worst ambulance ride, from Anonymous. I work as a paramedic, and this was my worst ambulance ride. It was around noon one day when we got a call for a motorcycle accident. The report said a female stole a motorcycle and drove away frantically, managing to drive off the road into a head-on collision with a tree. As we arrived on the scene, I was surprised that the woman was mumbling something over and over. Usually going that fast into a hard obstacle like a tree, there's not much left. In fact, she didn't really have any major injuries. We got her into the back of the ambulance, and my partner drove. I continued to check and monitor her vitals. As I was going over her heartbeat, she grabbed my arm aggressively. She spoke to me in a moan, and I swear to God, word for word, this is what she said. "He's coming. There's no escape." I pried her hand off of me and strapped her down. I told her, "Don't worry, you're completely safe, nobody can get to you. Now I need you to calm down." She looked at me with empty eyes and began to cry. She said, "It's too late. He found me." "What are you talking about?" I asked, as she looked over my shoulder and screamed, "Behind you." I turned around faster than the speed of light. Of course, there was no one there. I looked back and she stared at me, repeating the word "please" over and over. She was really struggling with her restraints. But then all at once she stopped and went silent. After a quiet few minutes, when we were near the hospital, she looked at me, smiled, and simply said, "You're next." I swear on my life, the very next moment, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I jumped, turning around, but we were alone in the back of the ambulance. When we made it to the hospital, she was treated for her wounds and sent to the psychiatric wing. I could lie and say I heard bumps in the night or saw someone standing outside my house after that, but I didn't. I got home on edge and told my wife everything about what had happened. And to this day, I can't explain how I felt that breath on my neck. Possible possession. From Anonymous. About 6 months after graduating nursing school, I was working as an RN at a local community hospital on the night shift. I was receiving and admitting patients to my unit. One night I received a man from the ED that had been admitted for altered mental status and hyperglycemia. The man was in his mid-30s and was accompanied by his mom. He arrived on the unit screaming about the end times, and he kept repeating the words, "It burns, it burns." He even looked at me and said that we're all going to burn. We tried to calm him down and even administer a sedative to help him calm down, but it didn't work. His body just wouldn't respond to it. His mannerisms were odd too, because he would curl back his lips and roll his tongue around while sticking it out and screaming. His pupils were noticeably dilated, giving them the appearance of being solid black. He normally walked with a cane but kept jumping steadily to his feet and attempting to leave the unit with a very steady gait. We finally got him restrained, and he spent 5 days on my unit screaming day and night, sleeping in small increments of time. One night while he was sleeping, another nurse crept into his room and removed the Bible from the bedside table and silently approached the man to place the Bible on him. The man, without even opening his eyes, said loudly, "Don't touch me with that book." The nurse was so frightened, she ran out of the room. On the 5th day, he had been sleeping some through the night, and he just woke up alert and completely oriented, as if none of this had happened. The man was back to being his pleasant self, soft-spoken and made absolute sense in everything he said. I still think of this man sometimes, and I've done a lot of research into possession. But even now, I can't completely understand this experience. I wonder if demons really do exist. Warning: the story contains animal violence. Some viewers may find it disturbing. If you are one of those viewers, you have been warned. A horrific EMT story from Mythology Loves Horror. I hate my job sometimes, but being able to save people is still worth the horrifying, often disgusting calls that my team responds to. Now 6 years into my career as an EMT, I have to take sleeping medication because I can't stop having nightmares about some of the things that I've seen. To put it bluntly, my more horrific memories go from run-over children to whole families being burned alive. But one of my more recent calls is still giving me acute anxiety. Even after half a decade of working weird hours, I still don't enjoy being awakened at 1 a.m., especially to a frantic phone call about a car accident, a shooting, or other disaster. Of course, that was what happened last week, and I still regret answering that call. The gruff, still sleepy voice on the other line was my boss, L, and we were needed at the scene of an accident. I was out the door in 5 minutes, and on the scene 10 minutes after that. In a small New England town like this, most people know you by name, and tonight was no exception. The first person I noticed when I arrived was Mrs. K, the mother of a kid that I'd gone through every grade with. She was sobbing, her hands wringing together hard enough to turn her knuckles white. She kept glancing from the officer talking to her over to the woods behind her house, and I began observing her body language for signs of pain or injury. She seemed okay, so my guess was that she wasn't the reason I was here. As he noticed my approach, the officer pulled me to the side and he briefed me on what was happening. I was informed that Mrs. B had called the police because she and her teenaged son Jay were out walking their expensive purebred dog Max when some man jumped them. He had punched Jay and then tried to snatch Max. The dog had gotten out of the man's grip and ran off, but the man had chased after him. When Jay regained consciousness a few minutes later, he had stupidly taken off after the two, and Mrs. K had stayed behind to wait for the police. The officer went on to tell me that my boss L had requested that, since I knew the area well, I join the search team in case Jay's head injury was serious enough for him to pass out or suffer other injuries. I nodded in agreement, and my mind already mapped out the layout of the woods. I'd grown up with Mrs. K's boys, and we had played hide-and-seek out there in those 15 acres that their family owned many times before. I knew there was a deep river, as well as a large ravine out there, and both could be treacherous if someone was running through the woods blindly. I asked the officer if he knew which way Jay had gone, and he pointed directly behind the house, rather than to the paths off to either side. I thanked him for the info, and as I made my way over to Mrs. K, I recalled that this wasn't the first missing dog case that I had heard of recently. My buddy S down at the police station had told me the day before that several purebreds had gone missing in the last 2 weeks. This was something that didn't normally happen in a town like ours. I stopped and talked with Mrs. K for a moment, and I reassured her that I would bring both Jay and Max home safely. At that moment, L arrived with a few other men, and once he had us outfitted with flashlights, walkie-talkies, and bulletproof vests, he assigned each of us a quadrant of the woods to check. Mine was the furthest away from where the assailant had gone. As the only non-police member of the group, I was given the easiest area to search, and within minutes of setting off, I'd lost both sight and sound of the other group members. The large, sudden influx of humans had startled the wildlife, and the nighttime woods were eerily quiet. In about half an hour, I'd covered most of my quadrant, and was about to radio in an all clear when I stopped. I thought that I'd heard something, but after listening for another moment without hearing anything, I shrugged it off. I began to speak into the walkie-talkie, but I stopped mid-sentence, my finger hovering over the button. The sound came again, and I knew then that it was a bark. I called out to Max, and when I heard an answering woof, I began to follow the sound. I passed along the western riverbank, careful that I don't slip in the mud. Another bark steered me forward, and I couldn't keep the smile off of my face. This wasn't turning out to be that bad of a call, and it hadn't had the blood and gore that so many of my other nights had. I was in high spirits until I pushed my way through a nettle thicket and came to an abrupt halt. There, crouched about 30 feet in front of me, was a man. His back was to me, but he let out an excited bark the way a dog does when its human comes home after work. Then he stood up, and instead of talking to me, he began to sing "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window." He slowly turned to look at me, and around his mouth was fur from a Dalmatian. Max was a Dalmatian. Jagged holes had been cut out for the man's eyes, and a shoestring was holding it in place as little chunks of Max slid down the man's cheek. I stood there in horrified silence, too stunned to even scream. I saw the glint of the crimson-splashed knife in his hand, and I couldn't bear the tension any longer. I turned, fleeing as quickly as I could. I sent out a frantic radio message, even though I knew that they wouldn't be able to get there before the man caught up to me. I was running blindly, and I could hear him laughing as he sprinted. He was coming for me. That was when I tripped and rolled across the leaf-strewn ground, right over the lip of the ravine. I smashed my head against a rock, and I didn't wake up for almost 2 days. When I regained consciousness, I was at the local hospital, and within seconds my mom and girlfriend had their arms around me. Turns out the man had also tripped into the same ravine, but he wasn't as lucky as me. The knife he had been carrying got lodged in his neck, and the coroner estimated that it had only taken minutes for the dog killer to bleed out. Jay was found safe a mile away, and they were able to recover Max's body for a proper cremation. Later that night, my boss L swung by to see me, and he filled me in on the man's background. His name was H. Parker, and he had been under house arrest while a murder case was pending. He was only 19 and had run away from 2 towns over. Apparently, as a young child, he had been diagnosed as a sociopath, and since a young age he had displayed conduct disorder behaviors, typical of mentally deficient individuals. He had a history of violence against both people and animals. It had manifested at the age of 5, when he began to pluck the eyes off of stuffed animals. The man's mother, who had to work 3 jobs just to keep their family from being homeless, hadn't known how badly things progressed. I almost felt bad for him, until I remembered him wearing the animal's skin on his face. I still have nightmares about that terrifying mask. I don't think I'll ever be free of the image of him wearing Max on his face. You get used to it. From The Other Malfoy. I worked as a security guard at one of the local hospitals, and despite what I'm going to tell you, it's a pretty great place to work. Plentiful hours, pay is good, and the nurses are downright sweet. That being said, it is still a hospital, and as such it comes with its bad things. I confess, and forgive me if I come across as a little bit morbid, I've been in the presence of more death in the first 6 months on the job than the previous 30 years of my entire life. But that's not exactly what this is about. No, this story is about the hospital basement. I had initially been hired to work a specific area of the hospital, and I had daytime hours. But when a full-time evening shift opened up, I went for it. Gotta make that money. This meant I had free range to patrol the whole property. One of the areas I got to patrol was the basement. Contrary to what you might think, it's a pretty busy part of the building. X-ray department, custodian, engineering, food prep, those are just some of the many departments that fill the basement. So it's not exactly a spooky, damp, and dark place. But once 8 p.m. hits and the vast majority of employees have gone home, that basement gets quiet. And that's when the incidents began. It was my first week as patrol officer, and so far it had been rather uneventful, which I was fine with. I'd had 5 years' experience with private security in other areas, and I was hoping for less action for a while. One night I was making my rounds in the basement when I heard footsteps. Normally this is no big deal, but it was very late, so it drew my attention. Still, I wasn't thinking it was a big deal. Maybe a nurse had to grab something or a visitor took a hilariously big wrong turn. So I wandered over in that direction. As I approached the corner, I checked the wall mirror. For those of you who don't know, hospitals have ball-shaped mirrors to allow staff to check around corners, thus preventing any gurney fender benders. When I did this, I saw nothing. No people, no shadows, no movement of any sort. I rounded the corner to make sure, and it was an empty hallway. Only place they could turn into were the elevators, which I would have heard the ding from if someone had entered them. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. Probably my brain messing with me. A similar incident happened a few days later. While checking to make sure engineering didn't leave their equipment in plain sight, again, I suddenly hear voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was for sure human voices. I went to check, out of curiosity more than anything else, but no matter where I walked, the voices always seemed distant. I didn't see anyone, and I must have walked the entire basement, but the voices always sounded so distant. Then, suddenly, it went quiet, just like that. It was as if they had disappeared, left the area. How very strange, but again, I chalked it up to nothing unusual. Maybe a custodian left a radio or podcast on. In my mind, it was all easily explained and no big deal. While that could have been explained easily enough, this next one was unnerving, because I still cannot explain it. It was another day, another basement patrol. I was walking down a large stretch of hallway when, in front of me, I noticed a set of doors closing. These are fire doors that are held open magnetically and automatically close upon the fire alarm going off, which incidentally had happened earlier. A false alarm, though. Clearly, these two hadn't been pushed open after the all clear, so I walked towards them to do the job myself. Then one of them opened up, not swung open aggressively, but just casually opened up, like someone was just passing through. This caused me to stop in my tracks in shock. These doors are quite heavy. Nobody could have just yanked it open and ducked out of sight like that. This door was pushed to the wall all the way in a smooth motion, not shoved, not opened slightly. Unless there was a very specifically located hurricane in that spot, those doors were not hit by a sudden draft. Needless to say, I patrolled a more populated area that night. There were also the cold spots. So many cold spots in that basement. It wasn't wind or air conditioning, these were specific moments of cold that randomly disappeared shortly afterwards. These were not normal. They were everywhere. Not just the same spots every time, different spots. Spots where it should have been warm, like by the food prep kitchen or near the CT scan room. It just didn't really make sense. A few weeks of this, and I was just doing my best to ignore it. Job paid well, and I didn't want to abandon ship like that, but that nearly changed one evening. I was on another basement patrol. Woo-hoo, I guess. Sadly, I couldn't skip it, or say that I did. The higher-ups would know. They always know. So I'm back again, late at night, in the creepy, empty basement, reminding myself that my car will be paid off a lot faster with this salary. I approached the corner from the first incident. Coincidentally, instinctively, I checked the wall mirror. I froze. There I saw a figure around the corner. Not a person, but a human-shaped black mass, just standing there, just around the corner. I'm horrified at this point. My mind was already on high alert. Now it was on red alert. I tried to reason with myself. Is it a smudge on the mirror? No, they clean those things daily. I was scared, shaking, wishing I had a fellow guard with me. But what good would that really do, honestly? I'm praying to God, Odin, Ra, freaking Santa Claus at this point, praying that this thing does not decide to move towards me. I'm standing there for what seemed like forever, when it finally walks the opposite direction of me. Defying all sense of reason, I decided to poke my head around the corner, try to get a look at this thing. It was gone by then, disappeared. I even checked the mirror again, and it was clear as well. Just me in the basement. I scrambled upstairs on a sprint and spent the shift around the nurse's station, expecting very little sleep that night when I made it home. A couple of months later, short of the aforementioned cold spots, things had calmed down. I began working an earlier shift, and I was down in the basement with a coworker doing the rounds when I heard the sound of voices. Now, admittedly, this could be anyone that time of day, but I was still quite paranoid about the basement, so my mind instantly goes to the worst possible explanation. I stopped, then turned to my coworker. Then I asked, probably sounding freaked out, if they could hear the voices. To my immense relief, they said yes, and I calmed down. Then my coworker said, "You get used to it." I instantly stopped and stared at them. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "Voices, weird noises, all that crap. Work here long enough and you just get used to it, especially down here. I assume you've seen or heard something, judging by how you looked like a deer in the headlights just now." I nod and explain my experiences. They say, "Yeah, most of us have all had similar incidents when patrolling down here. Don't worry about it. You'll learn to shrug it off." I'll add quickly that this coworker is older than me and has been with the company for about 15 years, which to me explained how they were so casual and nonchalant about it, while I was losing my mind. "But why this area?" I asked. "Never anywhere else." "Do you really have to ask?" They laughed. And then it hit me, and I almost kicked myself for not figuring it out sooner. The silhouette, the footsteps, the voices, the door, even the majority of cold spots, they all happened within a close proximity of the morgue. I'd been given a tour of the facility when I started, but seeing as I was assigned a specific post when I began, I kinda just forgot about the morgue and where it was located. "Why wasn't I told?" I asked them. "Because if we had just told you outright, you probably wouldn't have believed us. Admit it," they responded. And I can admit they were probably right. If they had mentioned it on day one, I would have laughed it off as either messing with the new guy or just silly stories. So I can't blame them. I worked at that hospital for a year before being transferred to a different site. Still a hospital, but this one doesn't have an ER, ICU, or a morgue. So I feel better about it. My coworkers are great, and the job still pays well, and I genuinely want to be here. But I still double-check those mirrors when I approach any corner, and I still jump at any sound when I'm alone, at night on the job. And I hope, against hope, that I'll eventually get used to it. My mom's experience with the dead. From Daniela S. My mom was in the hospital when she was 23. She'd gotten in a really bad motorcycle accident and had broken both her legs. She'd also hurt her head really bad. It was late in the night and she woke up from a very restless sleep, but she didn't open her eyes right away for some reason. Something in her told her to keep them shut. My mom is from Vietnam and grew up in a very spiritual family. This subject isn't something she takes lightly. When she finally did open her eyes, it was because of a murmur, like someone was trying to talk to her. Her hospital bed was surrounded by pale people. The whole room seemed to be filled with pale people, all trying to get a good look at her. But as soon as she looked at them, they all began to look down at their feet. She was in such shock that she kinda just calmed down and tried to make sense of it. The murmuring grew louder and louder until it sounded like the whole room was quietly mumbling, dozens of people mumbling to each other, but she couldn't see anyone's lips actually move. Then one of them lifted their hand and tried to reach out to her, still not looking at her. That's when my mom began to panic and scream. She says it felt like she blacked out until a nurse came running in, but my mom was found sitting up in bed. The nurse told her it was probably a hallucination from her concussion, and after a long time of soothing her, Mom finally went back to sleep. She didn't experience anything else until she got pregnant with me, and we moved to Korea. One day as she was taking the bus, she noticed that amongst a line of people getting on was a very familiar figure, a pale person who only looked at the ground. They boarded the bus. The bus driver didn't even seem to acknowledge them. My mother began to cry and became hysterical when the person moved down the middle of the bus. It was then she saw that they seemed to be floating. Their feet were flat against nothing beneath them. An older woman came to comfort her, and when Mom looked back where the person had been, they were gone. From that day until we moved to America, she had no further problems. Eventually, she would be pregnant with my brother, and she began seeing these people everywhere, in the stores, in the streets, and even outside our home. It was a difficult pregnancy. She ended up going to the hospital a number of times with smaller complications. When she was there, she would scream and cry if she was ever left alone. In the hospitals, it's where she saw them most. She said they were everywhere. Every which way she looked, they were there. The only way she'd feel safe was if someone was with her, because then the strange pale people wouldn't come any closer. The night after she gave birth to my brother, we were all sleeping in one room because she'd been pretty wrecked by the delivery. The hard pregnancy was nothing compared to actually giving birth to him. Dad says she nearly died, but I don't know how much of that is true. She woke up again in the middle of the night with my brother next to her, and again her bed was surrounded by those people. One of them was holding her hand on the baby's forehead, and at first my mom freaked until she noticed how my brother was pale. But instead of calling out for help, she didn't move. The pale woman stroked the baby's hair over and over until he began to grow pink again, and finally he took a breath. Then she woke up in the morning as a nurse came in to look at the baby. The pale people were gone. Dad and I were still sleeping, and nothing seemed different. The nurse looked over my brother and said that he was fine. Mom says that at that moment, she realized that whoever they weren't trying to hurt or scare her. She thinks they're just lost souls or something of the sort, and that her son did almost die that night. But one of them helped him back to life. Then again, maybe it was all dreams, hallucinations. But she tells this story with such sincerity that I can't help but believe her. Now she only sees a few in times of great stress, and she never gets scared of them now. But I still worry. I'm not 100% sure they're good guys. I'm scared that the one who held her hand on my brother wasn't giving him life, but perhaps had been the one taking it. I've heard of spirits taking living bodies to come back to the real world. I just hope Mom is right about them. The Cold Hallway, from C.E. Scrivener. Everyone has different beliefs in the paranormal, but I've always been fascinated by it. It's sort of a hobby for me, I guess. But after this experience, I'll forever have a new perspective on the unexplained. This happened a few years ago when a friend of mine was in a serious car accident. Me and a group of our friends went to the hospital to visit, but he was still in surgery, so we sat in the waiting room for any news. At one point, I got restless and decided to make my way to the cafeteria for some coffee. It was the very early hours of the morning. As I'm making my way down the somewhat empty halls, I hear footsteps approaching me from behind. I turned, expecting to find a nurse, or maybe one of my friends coming to join me. But there was no one in the hall. The corridor was silent, save for the few normal noises like machines or the muffled, distant chatter of workers. Something felt off, but I tried to ignore it, as me not being a fan of hospitals. I turned to continue walking. That's when a sudden feeling washed over me, and I froze in place. You know that tingling feeling you get when someone is standing behind you? Goosebumps wash over you and you turn expecting to see someone. This is what I did, but I was once again met with the emptiness of the hallway. The feeling persisted, and I felt all the hair on my body standing on end. The air became cold to the point I could see my breath. I couldn't hear the previous sounds of machines or chatting now. It was like a switch was flipped, and everything became muffled. I was petrified. I didn't know what was happening nor what to do. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. It was like something had taken complete control of me. For what felt like hours being held by this cold, unseen force, I then felt a sudden rush of coldness, as if something had just passed right through me, and just like that, it was gone. I stood there in shock, trying to figure out what had just happened to me. "You felt it, didn't you?" I suddenly heard a voice, and I looked to find an old woman in a hospital gown walking past me to what I assume was her room. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused, and she looked back and smiled at me. "It comes whenever someone dies around here. Don't worry, it won't hurt you." She spoke almost amused by my shock. "What comes?" I asked, not really sure if I wanted to know. The woman gave me another smile. "The Reaper, honey." After that exchange, I noped out of there at record speed, nearly falling over my own feet, until I made it to the waiting room. I chose not to share my experience with my friends. They would have just told me I was tired, but I knew it was more than that. Sadly, soon after that experience, we received the unfortunate news that our friend had passed away. His brain injury was too severe. We went home in complete silence, and the next day, I could not stop thinking about what happened. What I felt that day, I know was not natural. Could I have really encountered a Reaper? And I can't help but wonder, was it there for my friend? Ghost in the Asylum. From Insulting. I have a very real ghost encounter to tell you. It happened at a very populated haunted attraction. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is a hospital in West Virginia that is rumored to be haunted. And let me tell you that there is no rumor about it, because I know it's 100% true. It was Halloween. I was 17 and had a bunch of friends with me at the time. First, I've got to explain that the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum offers you a deal. If you pay $100 a person, you can stay the night at the haunted hospital, and if you stay till 5 a.m., you get 70% of your money back. We all decided that this year was the year we were going to stay the night. The nighttime stay didn't start until 11 p.m., so we decided to go do the haunted house tour and a couple of other spooky things to wait it out. When 11 p.m. came around, we hurried and ran to the front doors of the asylum and walked in. There were 6 of us in total, 3 guys and 3 girls. It was $600 to do this haunted night stay. When you stay the night at this haunted hospital, you're given an EMF reader and a flashlight. They took our phones because they didn't want us to use the flash or to use the flashlight on them. We were so lucky because we were the only group that was staying the night on Halloween. So after they went over the rules with us, we would be on our own until 5 a.m. Well, if you could last that long. I'll tell you a little bit about the haunted asylum. It has a total of 3 floors and was constructed in the 1800s. At first, it was a hospital meant to house older, sick patients and to give them the best care they could. But the 200 limit quickly turned to 2,000, and the hospital was so packed they had people on hospital beds in the hallways. Now, our group was aware that this place was a place where people would send their loved ones. It said their loved ones would be experimented on and often killed. But of course, this is what excited us about staying the night, as well as the thought of catching a glimpse of a ghost. At 2:40 a.m., we walked all the halls and looked in all the rooms, but never saw anything. But we soon did hear the sound of a girl singing. It seemed to be a lullaby coming from down the hall. I quickly looked at my friends to see their reactions, and they were just as stunned and frightened as I was. We quickly pointed our flashlights down the hallway where the singing was coming from and made our approach to the room. I could finally start to hear the song itself, something like, "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna kill all of these little girls. And when the little girls are gone, Mama's gonna kill the rest of them." That's when my flashlight went out, then Ashley's, and so did Ethan's. Those were the only 3 flashlights the guide gave us, and now we had nothing to help us see. The only thing lighting the hallway and the rooms was the moonlight from the full moon shining through some cracks in the roof. We were 2 doors away from the room with the singing, and I swear I could make out a half body and face leaning out of the room, looking right at us. Just then, a cloud or something must have moved, because a beam of moonlight shone through one of the cracks and right on the figure. It was a woman in white. Her face was scarred up, and she was looking right at us with an awful grin. Her eyes were as black as the night, and she had this almost rotten egg smell coming off of her. She took a step out of the door and into the hallway. To my horror, she appeared to be holding the severed arm of a child. She starts to take steps towards us, but has a funny movement to her, almost like she's glitching one foot after another. The smell gets worse as she approaches, then a cloud or something blocks the moonlight again, and she vanishes. I started to walk backwards, shaking and wanting to soil myself. I'd never been so scared. "Travis," someone whispered right beside me. I could hear my name. "Travis, you and your friends will never leave this place." Quickly, I scream for it to shut up, and I turn 180 degrees. We all take off in a dead sprint towards the stairs. It's such a long run, and I can hear someone behind us dragging their feet, knocking things over in the hall. As I look back, some more moonlight is coming through, giving me just enough light to see that woman sprinting at us, screaming our names. I almost tripped over the railing down the staircase as we all ran over each other to get to the front door. But there was a problem. They don't want you to leave without letting a staff member know, so the front doors are locked, and the only way to let someone know that you want out is to ring a bell next to the door that will alert someone to come let you out. Well, we start ringing the hell out of that bell, but I could hear just the lowest and quiet whisper, repeatedly saying, "Travis, Travis." I glance back one more time. I see her at the top of the steps looking down on us with that god-awful grin. Right after I saw her, the door swung open as we basically stampeded over the staff member who unlocked it for us. We were safe. They fixed up some hot cocoa and let us explain what happened. The spooky thing is that the staff didn't have the reaction I was looking for. They didn't laugh or say we were lying. They had a look of, I know exactly what you saw. Needless to say, after this encounter, we never stayed the night there again. We still do go every year to the haunted house part, but I will not ever set foot back in that asylum. To the listeners out there, believe me or not, but I encourage you to come to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum and experience it yourself. But be warned, things do happen there, and that ghost lady we saw, she's supposedly named Emily. And supposedly back in 1867, she was taking care of a little girl, but not in a loving way. She could not stand the girl's crying, so after singing her a lullaby, she smothered the girl with a pillow. And, well, you can probably guess the rest. Never look behind you. From Paranormal Poltergeist 666. I come from a small town in Virginia. This town also happens to be home to a well-known abandoned insane asylum. In simple terms, the building sits overlooking my small town and was originally opened as a school in the 1890s, but was shut down in 1911 after a few homicides. In 1916, it was reopened as an experimental psychiatric facility. There were constant issues with overcrowding and negligence. The hospital was shut down in 2003. If the story behind the building isn't enough to keep you away, let my experience be a warning to you to stay out. It all began a few months ago when the owners of the building began to advertise a public paranormal investigation event. As I'd always been fascinated by the paranormal, I decided to buy my boyfriend and I tickets to the event. I had just started making a YouTube channel and had decided that this would make a great first video. However, that video never made it onto my channel. A couple of weeks later, I stood outside of the beautifully broken building with amazement in my eyes. I always saw beauty in destruction when it came to abandoned buildings like this one. As soon as we were escorted inside of the main area of the building, the atmosphere changed quickly. A feeling of dread surrounded me, and it suddenly felt as though I had an extra 100 pounds on my shoulders. The air was so heavy it felt as though I was suffocating. I decided to ignore the uneasiness around me, and I took a deep breath as I followed the group up the stairway into the patient corridors. The tour guide began to tell the story of a 10-year-old boy who became a patient to the hospital in the 1940s, but unfortunately he died a few weeks later. As soon as the tour guide finished his sentence with, "and then he died," a door to my left suddenly swung open with violent force and slammed into the wall behind it, allowing pieces of drywall to fall to the floor. I flung my body back towards my boyfriend, and my heart began to race. However, I decided to continue the tour anyway. Eventually, it concluded with little interaction from spirits. But then the real horror began. My boyfriend and I split off with some other people and made our way down the stairs toward the basement for the investigation portion of the night. I'd always heard that the basement was one of the most active spots in the building, so I wanted to set the camera up there and try to capture something. As we were making our way down the corridor, my boyfriend and the other 5 or 6 people were a few feet ahead of me talking amongst themselves. I followed behind them at a slow pace, as I wasn't sure I wanted to be down here after what I had experienced upstairs. All of a sudden, I felt a tug on the back of my shirt, and I heard a harsh whisper say my name.
Jenny.
I didn't dare turn to look and see what was standing behind me. Instead, I broke free from the grasp of this thing and sprinted to join the rest of the group in the middle of the corridor. A little bit of time had passed, and my boyfriend and I decided to set up our camera in the morgue, which was a portion of the basement. We wanted to make an attempt to communicate with the spirits through flashlight signals. "Is there anyone here?" I asked, pointing towards the flashlight that I had propped up on a small wooden chair. If so, make this light turn off." Immediately, the flashlight begins to frantically flash on and off, and I feel the same tug on the back of my shirt.
"Jenny!"
It repeated its harsh whisper again. It repeated it over and over. I did all I could to attempt to break free from the force behind me. However, this time I could not move. I screamed at my boyfriend to get help, and he quickly ran out the door and into the corridor. However, it felt like fire was burning at my skin, on my back, and all of a sudden I had an overwhelming urge to turn around in an attempt to make the pain stop. I swiftly maneuvered my body to face towards the force and immediately made contact with glowing maple-colored eyes of a tall shadow figure behind me. I felt myself stop screaming, and my body froze up. I stood staring at the shadow figure as a sinister smile spread across its face. As I continued to stare into its eyes, I felt drawn towards it. It felt like hours before my boyfriend ran back in with a security guard, when I knew in fact it had only been a few minutes. Just as they frantically burst through the door, the force released its grip on me and dissipated as if it had never been there. I felt as though I was in a trance while my boyfriend grabbed all the equipment and grabbed my wrist, dragging me up the stairs. Once we arrived in the parking lot, I was finally able to break free from that trance I was in and begin to cry and break down. That was the scariest thing I'd ever experienced. As I look back on the events now, I would like to think that the events that night were caused by an emotional breakdown from stress, but I think my boyfriend and I both know it was far more than that. Now I'm finding it very difficult not to be drawn to the building once again. My mom's office is haunted. Submitted by Sophie. My mom works as a secretary at a public health department. The building where these offices are located used to be part of a public hospital that is still running today. However, the wards and doctors' offices that used to be there were relocated to a much more modern building nearby some years ago. But some things have remained, because several things have happened in that building, and most of the people that work there have witnessed some events. For instance, the security guards have caught shadows and flying orbs moving around the building in security camera footage, and those who patrol the area on foot always talk of seeing shadows out of the corner of their eyes. There's a lady that works there whose office is at the back of the building, and every day at around 4 in the afternoon, someone knocks on her office door, and every time she checks, there is no one there. The hallway is always empty. Before she grew used to it, it really scared her. It can't be someone playing a prank, because her office is at the very back of an extremely long hallway that has no offices or doors nearby for anyone to hide in. And even when she leaves the door open and can look outside, she still sees no one when the knocking comes by. My mom has also seen the shadows and orbs among other things, and has even been present when the knocking occurrence happened. She tells me that one time, she and a coworker of hers were chatting in the break room when suddenly, out of nowhere, her coworker's hair flew to the side as if someone was holding and pulling on it, and then she saw it fall back onto her coworker's shoulders. My mom let out a quick scream, and the coworker asked what was wrong. Before she explained, they got the heck out of there first. It couldn't have been the air current, because trust me, I've been there. That room is like a giant cupboard with no windows, and the only entrance and exit is a massive and heavy wooden door. A door that I could never open myself until I was older. Mom and her coworkers have also told me about a spirit that often appears around my mom's current office. They say she looks like a nurse, and that she remains there because she passed away while working a shift. I don't know any other details, but I'd love to know more. When my sister and I were little, sometimes Mom would take us to her office because she didn't have anyone to take care of us, and we were still too young to stay home alone. I was told that when my sister and I were little, we would often talk with someone, and we would always play pretend that we were nurses. We were always nurses, not teachers, mommies, astronauts, any other thing a kid would want to be when they're older. No, just nurses. And the people around us that saw us playing were always impressed or surprised, apparently by how accurate the situations we played out were, and how we were able to use a lot of nursing terms that we'd never heard before. At the time, we were only 5 and 7 years old respectively. When someone would ask us how we knew these things, we would always answer one thing. A nice lady had told us all about it. One time we apparently even pointed to the corner of the room, a corner that was completely empty. Needless to say, this freaked some people out. These days, neither my sister nor I remember playing or talking with that lady, but we do remember playing and pretending that we were nurses a lot. Every time you walk down through certain hallways in that old hospital, you get the eerie feeling that someone is following you and watching. And at night, this feeling only gets worse, to the point there are times you can even hear footsteps following you everywhere. In that building, it's almost like you're never alone. I've experienced this once when my mom had to go to her office at night to finish up a few things, and I went along with her. I was walking down a corridor that had some old laboratories and where the lab technicians used to store samples, when I heard a faint sound of footsteps. At first, I was sure it was my own echo from my own feet, but then they began to get louder and closer. I freaked out so much that I ran to where my mom was, and all the way there, I swear I heard those same footsteps running and actually gaining on me. Now that I'm in college, I don't spend as much time at that office as I used to. However, I still pop in from time to visit since I go to college nearby. Sometimes I too see glimpses of shadows from the corner of my eye. Ghosts in a Castle, submitted by Michael P. This story is a short one because I was only at this destination for about an hour, but it was long enough to experience something bizarre. To begin, this happened during a vacation of mine. I was on a tour in Victoria in the early morning. It is a very beautiful place to visit. I looked up one of the haunted places nearby, and I quickly found one of the popular spots, called Craigdarroch Castle. Now, a little history on the castle. It was built by one of the richest people at the time, who happened to pass away before he even got to live in his massive mansion. For a time, it sat vacant and empty because nobody could afford it, and eventually it became a hospital and a college, so it's no wonder that it's haunted. During the tour, I had some snacks and some water, and as soon as I went in, I felt as though I was not welcome, as if you were intruding into someone else's home. Then I suddenly felt dizzy, but it was weird. I didn't feel dizzy before I went in, and near the end of the house I saw some sort of dark shadow dart out of the living room. By the time we got that deep into the place, I was so dizzy I had to leave the building to get some fresh air. Later I went into the building again. This time the feelings were gone, and everything seemed normal. I asked the staff if the house was haunted. They replied with an emotionless, "There are no ghosts here," which is a lie, because I later saw an even more detailed figure on the same side of the house on the 3rd floor. It was speed walking, and it looked to be some sort of nurse, perhaps from the 19th or early 20th century, and whoever they were staring at me. and when I blinked, the figure was gone. What made this compelling was that it showed up a few feet away of a group of people. A few months later, I looked up other people's paranormal experiences. Some people claim they were drawn to the building by some unnatural force. Others felt unwelcomed, like I did. Some felt ice-cold feelings, and some have even heard the piano on the top floor playing by itself. If anyone wants to go to Craigdarroch Castle, be warned. As a former hospital and a castle with a tragic past, many have passed away there, and it seems like a few of them have stayed behind. The Old Quarantine Station. Submitted by Akasha. I live in NSW, Australia, and I've always had paranormal experiences happen to me throughout my life. But this is my first time sharing my story. Now, my birthday is right next to Halloween, so naturally I love anything scary. I'm always up for a Halloween-themed party and stuff like that. Well, one year, I booked a group of my close friends and I to go to the old Manly Quarantine Station. We were going to go on the adult ghost tour. This place has a lot of history, but some of my friends are skeptics, but we all went to have some fun. The tour takes you right into the darkness, all around the grounds, and gives you a history of what happened back in the 1800s. You see, a lot of people passed away of disease, while others were hurt in the name of quarantine. Me and a friend of mine in particular found this place very, very creepy. I don't remember the order that we saw these buildings, but let me tell you what we saw and felt ourselves. There is even a chamber for gas, where people were sent to make them clean. I can't remember what they used, but let's just say it wasn't fun. Most would live, but those that did would not live well. Medicine was still developing, and most people thought they were doing the right thing, but people were in pain breathing in these small rooms, and eventually would die if they didn't leave the compound. Our guide told us this, then split us into groups to go into separate rooms. They shut the door behind us, and I'm holding my friend's hands in the dark as we stand in the room for about 5 minutes. I could barely breathe. It felt very compact and claustrophobic, as well as creepy, and soon I began to freak out. My friend was also scared at this point, and I could hear others in my group reacting the same way, and a couple of them were just confused. When the door finally opens to release us, I bolt out, pulling my friend along with me. Once we're back outside, the guide tells us that many people would react the same way while they were in that room. They turn then beckon us to continue. He tells us more about the buildings around us, and my friends stay close. Whilst we walk around, I noticed a figure, a black silhouette, trailing the group from behind. I turn back on occasion to see it following still. It's never more than a dark shadow. I could not make out any details. I mention it to my friend, but he sees nothing, yet he says that he felt uneasy. We go towards the old hospital when my friend suddenly asks me a similar question, but he asks me if I see the little girl. I look in the direction he points, and I see nothing. I say to just keep an eye out for her and to let me know. He describes a blonde girl with pigtails, very young, but I still don't see what he's talking about. Even more creeped out, we continue into the hospital, which is well lit. My friend is randomly jumping, as if he's hearing loud noises go off around him. I ask what's wrong, and he's seeing the little girl apparently diving under a bed, hopping from spot to spot. Was he hallucinating? Was I hallucinating? At this point, the guide had finished talking, and they let us walk about. I dragged my friend over and asked if a little girl had been seen. The guide blinks at me, surprised, but says yes. A little girl has been seen here many times in the past on separate tours. I get my friend to describe her, and our guide nods and says that that fits past sightings, and that she's known to be benign. Walking out, I soon spot a woman's figure in a window, and I could very obviously tell she had an old nurse's hat. My friend continues to describe the behavior of the little girl, who's still following us along the trail, when she suddenly stops. My friend says she looks frightened, then suddenly vanished. Apparently, she didn't want to follow us any further. We are told the house up ahead was the gravedigger's house. He tells us the layout of the place and to go walk around freely. I hold on to my friends, and we walk inside. The first two rooms are bedrooms. I walk with them, feeling a sense of foreboding growing around me. Then we walk out to the kitchen with attached laundry rooms. I suddenly feel very terrified. In the dark of the laundry from the kitchen, where I'm standing, I can see the dark figure, and it brings with it an unbearable sense of terror. I nope out of there, running as fast as I can to the outside, where the guide was still waiting. He smiles at me with sympathy. He was apparently unsurprised that I just got frightened. He seemed to have been expecting it. He asks me what I saw. I tell him as my friends appear behind me soon after. They saw nothing, but still felt terrified enough to leave. We want to know what happened here, so we ask our guide for the rest of the explanation, and he says we must wait for the rest of the group so that he can tell everyone. Once they're all there, he tells us most diggers were hired as homeless men, given pay as food and housing, but they couldn't leave, even if they tried. Stories go that most of them were fond of the drink, and others were just plain crazy. Bodies began to be found behind the house and elsewhere on the grounds that they shouldn't have been. People were passing away. The last stop was the shower block, and apparently many people were washed with acid. Yes, acid. They forced you to be in it, and the guards around here weren't known to be kind. It's a large building with sunken areas to drain, with flimsy white curtains. Probably at least 20 stalls inside altogether. As a group, a creeped out group at that, we go inside, and I immediately felt afraid just looking at this place. There was a palpable sense that many terrible things had happened here. I walk about 10 meters more, then turn and leave as soon as I see a figure. It may have been a person from our group, but they were standing a little too far away to be part of the group. Not many of us lagged behind, but whoever this was seemed to just randomly appear, and I wasn't ready for something like that. Not again. Once we were all outside, the guide says that he heard there were a couple of birthday girls in the tour. Me and another person put our hands up. He says, just for us, he's going to let us go back alone into the shower block for 5 minutes. I vigorously decline, as does the other girl. Then he ends the tour by telling us to try not to take anything with us. And by anything, he's not talking about physical objects. He says, be sure not to bring any dark presences home with you. Most of us just laughed, but I admit, I said a little prayer, hoping that it really was a joke. This was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had, and I don't think I'll be going back to that old quarantine station. Spirit in the ER. Submitted by Arabian 92 Night. While I was working in the hospital as a housekeeper, I heard several other stories about different ghosts, especially the two that lived on my assigned floor. One was a little girl that I often felt holding my hand, and the other was a male that lived in the last room. That room had been refurbished into a makeshift apartment. The staff didn't want to use it for anything else any longer, because too many patients were being troubled by the spirits that resided there. My story comes from the 2 days I worked in the ER, and after that, I begged my boss to never assign me to that area again. Now on to the story itself. I was assigned to the ER with another coworker. We got along fine and chatted on the way down. Now, the ER is of course the busiest spot in the hospital, so cleaning rooms there was very fast-paced. But once we were down there and looking at the rooms that needed cleaning, I suddenly felt someone walk up on me and stand threateningly inside my personal bubble space. It happened so fast that I stepped to the side and looked to see who was there. I mean, I very obviously felt a presence, but I could see no one there, and it was startling. And on one occasion in that same area, I believe I got a glimpse of what this spirit looked like. At first it appeared as a shadow, but very quickly I could make out more and more details. This ghost was tall, dressed in a black cloak. It did not like me being there. Anyway, back to the previous experience. I don't know how long the two of us stood there, but when my coworker had everything we needed, we started working. But I could feel this heavy presence following me, always glaring me down. It got to the point where I just wanted out. I just wanted to leave this area as soon as possible. Eventually, I couldn't handle it. I broke down, feeling like no matter what I do, this thing would be hanging over me. The feeling didn't even pass until lunch that day, when I left the ER for my break. It felt so good to be out of there, and I was not ready to ever go back. But eventually I had to. It was my job. The second time I was down there the next day, the same thing happened. This time though, I was with the manager, and when the presence once again made me break down, she asked me what was wrong, if I was feeling sick. I've been called crazy before for telling people that I've seen things, and this was a really good paying job, and the job wasn't too hard. So for the sake of my job, I fibbed, telling her that there were some things from home that I couldn't stop thinking about, that were pretty stressful. Luckily, she understood. She even let me go to break early so I could calm myself down, which really did help. During my time working for this haunted hospital, I began to give the different spirits names. It sounds silly, but it helps me feel better about all of this. It makes it feel less serious. For example, there's an elevator that would open on its own before anyone would even push the button. I felt a presence there, and I often called it the gentleman. As for the ER spirit, the one that was dark and heavy, I called him the Dementor, after those things from Harry Potter. On those days that I was specifically assigned to work in the ER, I never felt happy. It seemed like I couldn't be happy or enjoy my work there. And when I left, I always felt drained of my energy. For anyone that does encounter spirits like this, let's just say chocolate works wonders after experiencing such things. The Women with No Face, submitted by Colin B. This happened when I was 10 years old, and it still haunts me to this very day. My father was a heavy smoker, and at one point in life he was admitted to the hospital because he couldn't stop throwing up in his sleep, which is very, very dangerous. On the day he was admitted, the doctors said that he had to stay for a month because of surgery and recovery. Now, being a 10-year-old boy, I was really depressed about this, scared for my father's life. I couldn't eat my food, and other times I would just cry. But when the hospital finally got my dad a room, me and my mom stayed with him nearly all the time. We even planned to stay there until he was released. Now, before I continue, I just want to say that me and my mom slept on a recliner. It was next to my dad's bed. I would sleep on the inside, and my mother on the outside. Well, one night, I woke up and realized that I needed to use the bathroom. So I got out of bed slowly, trying not to wake my mother, and I rubbed my sleepy eyes. Once my vision became more clear in that dark room, I looked at my dad, and I couldn't breathe. Because next to my dad, there stood a woman I'd never seen before. I definitely didn't know her or recognize her, but she was standing by my dad's gurney, looking down at him. I was about to yell, but I was too scared to make a word. I was just standing there, looking at her terrified, expecting her to do the absolute worst to my dad. But then she turned her head fast to look at me, and I will never forget what I saw. This woman, she didn't have a face. In the middle of her flesh-like facelessness, there was just a straight line where the eyes, nose, and mouth were supposed to be. It looked like her face had been folded inwards. I wanted to scream at the sight of it, yet for as long as the woman stared at me, I was too afraid to do anything. A few seconds later, the nurse came in the room to check on my dad, and when she came in, she noticed me standing there, asking if I was okay. But I didn't answer. I just pointed, in complete shock. When I turned towards the faceless woman, she was no longer there. She seemed to have vanished once the nurse opened that door. I was scared for the rest of that night, but a few minutes after just standing there and the nurse doing her stuff, I finally gathered the courage to run and use the bathroom, then get back to my mom's side. I thought that as long as I got my business done when someone else was in the room, I would be safe. The thinking of a scared child. But for the rest of that night, after the nurse left, when I laid there in the dark next to my mom, the only one of us that was awake, I couldn't sleep. Several sleepless hours later, I saw my mom begin to rise and shift from her sleep, and I was so glad to see that someone else was awake. As soon as she was more lucid, I explained to her what I saw. But as all parents usually do, she said that it was just a bad nightmare. But I knew better. I remember waking up. I remember the urge to go to the bathroom. I remember the nurse coming in and asking me if I was okay. None of that was a dream, even if I wish it was. There's one thing I wish I could forget, and it's that faceless creature. A few weeks passed by, and I didn't see a trace of that woman since. But on one similar night, I woke up, again with the same urge to use the bathroom. So of course I sat up and got out of bed, and I made it halfway across the room when I looked and saw her again. This time, she was sitting on the gurney by my dad's legs. I was scared again, and I couldn't speak once more, but this time, she actually said something. This inhuman spirit spoke to me.
She's coming,
she said, and she sounded more terrified than I was. I think if she had eyes, she would be crying. I asked in a trembling voice, Who's coming? But she didn't say anything back. She just pointed that faceless thing at me, and I was so afraid that I closed my eyes, and I kept them closed for a good minute. And when I opened them, she was gone. I ran back to my mom, holding in my bathroom urges, and I didn't sleep once more. The next day was a great day though, because my dad's health was cleared and he was getting released. After that, I never told anyone about the experience. I couldn't tell my mom because she wouldn't believe me again, and I just couldn't bring it up to tell my dad. He needed to focus on feeling better, and besides, could you imagine how much that would scare him if I really did tell him? I figured I'd just keep it to myself, and finally I'm ready to share it with you. If there was a moral to this story, it would be this. If you ever have to stay overnight at a hospital, or if you work there, don't be surprised if you see paranormal things or even a nightmare come alive. Hospitals are places of stress and pain. Some of that is bound to be left behind. The Kid and the Nurse, from Panda Marine. I was talking with my colleagues and friends about paranormal activities during my night shift back when I was an intern. A certain story creeped me out. This happened in a 4 or 5 story hospital. I can't remember exactly because I only worked at the ground level. During midnight, there was one nurse going down the levels via the ramp, which we used for those rolling beds. The ramp goes up to all floors since the hospital is old and doesn't have an elevator. Along the way, she found this kid, about 5 to 8 years of age. They were lost somewhere on the 2nd floor. The kid exclaimed that he was looking for his mama. After trying to find out where the kid had lost his mom, the nurse understood that he was describing the patient rooms at the 4th and 5th floor. So she escorted the kid just about a corner away from the nurse's station, telling him to talk to the nurses to locate his mom. She couldn't help him further as she was in a hurry to go downstairs for an emergency. The kid listened and went to the nurse's station, and she left for the bottom floor. As she arrived at the bottom floor, she asked the other nurses where the emergency was, and they directed her to the bed, saying that it was too late for the patient. The doctor had already declared the patient dead. She proceeded to the bed where the doctor was. Lo and behold, by the doctor was that dead patient, a child wearing the exact same outfit as the one she escorted to the nurse's station. I was frankly creeped out by this story, but I hoped it was probably just a story. It was a story that was passed on from colleague to colleague until it finally reached me. The proper full detail of the story has been lost by then. I can't even remember why the kid died or why he was in the hospital. I grew up in a third world country. Folks tend to be a little superstitious there. We have a lot of beliefs ranging from ghosts to demons and whatnot. It's usually a cautionary tale to make folks keep safe, to keep them away from the dark, to keep walking on the beaten path to avoid getting lost or worse, killed. But it's not rare to hear stories about ghosts in places where death is commonplace, like hospitals. There is no warning or message from this story of the kid and the nurse, except maybe on a personal level. Perhaps to some, it's the story of a loved one who doesn't want to cross to the afterlife yet. Others may see it as the constant life of healthcare professionals who battle against the jaws of death to keep people alive. Or maybe it's a symbol of the fear of death itself, that, in a way, the dead won't know they're dead. Warning: the following story contains mentions of assault. Stalker in the Woods, from Vladimir. The property I work at has a decent number of trees along the back. Some might even call it a mini forest. Within those woods are numerous animals, from deer to coyote. I've even seen foxes, bats, turkeys, and vultures. When I was first moved to third shift, the main thing I was told was to be aware of my surroundings when I was outside. At first, I was on high alert when I would take the trash out. The idea of meeting a coyote during my garbage run wasn't thrilling, even if a small part of me wanted to see one. After a while, when nothing happened, I lowered my guard and forgot about the warning. That was until my boss told me the animals weren't what I needed to watch out for. Apparently, people like to venture into those woods, and they enjoy causing problems for security. The reason she told me this was because on one of my nights off, a group of men came on the property and stole some air conditioners. Out there, every little sound made me pause. I would even hold my breath until I knew there was nothing there. As time went on and nothing happened, the warning erased itself from my mind. My work has a few sister locations, one of them being about a 10 to 20 minute walk from the back parking lot. The residents in that house are more mobile and more dangerous. If they weren't mentally disabled, they would be in jail. After learning this fact, you would think my boss's warning would have returned to me, but it didn't. It was either late 2018 or early 2019 when something happened that would make me remember. The dumpster company who empties our compactor had come late, so first and second couldn't take out the trash that day. The first half of my night was taking the 2 shifts garbage out myself. Eventually, it began to rain. I was elbow deep in garbage and soaking wet. You'd better believe I was angry. At one point, I started to cuss out loud, angrily throwing the trash away. I even kicked at the dumpster out of rage. Halfway done, though, I shut up, because something felt off. I had that feeling of eyes staring into my back, and it made me tense up. Had security caught me making a scene? I turned around, but I discovered I was alone. I couldn't figure out why I felt like someone was watching me. Ignoring it, I went back to tossing bags into the compactor, then went back inside. Stepping off the elevator, I was greeted by 3 East's floor supervisor. She asked me about all the trash, specifically third shifts, since no one had been able to pull it. With a sigh, I gave up and began doing my shift's trash. No sense waiting on it now, I thought. After 3 East, I made my way to 3 West, where I saw a resident staring out the kitchen window. That was odd, because she should have been asleep by then. I silently walked past, and I began to open the trash can. But I jumped when she grabbed my sleeve, taking me right out of my thoughts. "Oh, what is it, honey?" I asked. Her reply was simply to point. I glanced out and only saw rain and trees in that direction. Her finger then moved along the glass only to stop at what I assumed were the bushes. "There," she finally said. "Get it." Thinking she meant an animal, I nodded. "All right, I'll go get it. Just let me get the trash first," I answered. Satisfied with that answer, she walked back to her room. Luckily, the rain had died down when I made it back outside. A few feet away was a group of deer grazing. I've been able to gain a little trust with the deer at work, as I never bothered them when I'm out there and they never run off when they see me. They'll even come within a few inches near me, and as long as I don't make a sudden movement, they don't run away. That night was no different. They saw me and immediately went back to eating after I said a simple hello. As soon as I opened the squeaky door to the dumpster, I felt as if someone was staring at me again. Convincing myself it was one of the deer, I started to toss the trash inside. I then carefully closed the blue bin we used to escort garbage outside so as to not scare the deer. Then I scanned the area, but I couldn't shake that feeling that someone was watching me. Please just be deer, I thought to myself. At some point they had moved closer to me, but none of them were looking at me. All of their eyes were locked on the woods. Their bodies appeared positioned to run if needed. I immediately became nauseous. Was it coyotes? The deer would have run by now if it was coyotes, right? The sound of falling tree limbs breaking filled the area, which meant whatever was in there was closer than I hoped. At that point, the deer scattered, which meant it was time for me to go back inside. As I quickly pushed the blue bin, I heard the rustling of trees and bushes as if something was running. My power walk turned into a run. I got back inside and nervously waited for the door to shut, making sure it was locked. Suddenly, a message came over the intercom. "The building is on lockdown. No one is allowed in or out. I repeat, we are on lockdown until further notice." Lucky me, I didn't have to finish the trash that night. I wasn't 100% sure what the lockdown was for, though. I told security about what happened when I was outside, just in case it helped. Turns out, that was related to what had happened. At 7 a.m., I found out the full story. I found out how lucky I had been. One of the residents from the sister location, 20 minutes away, had escaped. He was one of the dangerous ones. He loved fighting and usually wouldn't stop until you weren't moving anymore. He also loved to physically assault people, if you catch my drift. It didn't matter what gender you were. If he got the urge, he'd force you down. And his favorite victims were people he thought were showing off, and to him that was people who cussed, threw tantrums, or beat up objects out of rage. Exactly what I'd been doing out there when he was lurking about in the woods. What if? From Jason R. I've shared one of my more memorable moments during my time as a detention deputy here already. At that time, I thought hearing an ethereal voice in the middle of an empty building would be the scariest moment of my life. But that fear came in the moment. As it would turn out, there's something even more frightening. A fear that comes half a month after something has happened. Something that seemed at the time to be pretty innocuous. As innocuous something could be in that profession. I'd been with the sheriff's office for a couple of years, and I was a wreck. I hated waking up and getting dressed for work. I spent 12 hours waiting in agony for the vestibule door to open and for my relief to walk in. When I got off work, I needed something to make the heck I sat through somehow seem worth it. In my case, this something was shiny, plastic, and expensive. I loved collectibles. I couldn't get enough of them. I loved them to the point of sheer stupidity. And as it would turn out, I loved them to the point that I pointlessly, unknowingly put my life in jeopardy. Worse still, I put the life of the person I love most in the world in jeopardy as well. Here's where things get crazy. I mean, stupid. I'd actually work overtime so I could buy pricier junk. Normally, this overtime was just a few extra hours. But still, considering how much I hated the place, it was stupid. It was a vicious cycle. Hate my work, buy something worthless to make it seem worth it, hate work even more. But that junk never filled the hole. I always needed pricier junk, so I worked even more. A vicious, idiotic circle. Now, each jail comes with a clinic. In a jail, clinics are essential. One day, the oncoming shift needed a deputy to sit on an inmate in the clinic. Now, in jail speak, sit means you stand guard over one inmate, not literally sit on them. This duty assignment is unique, usually reserved for suicidal inmates, or in this case, inmates that are hospitalized. This probably doesn't come as a surprise, but more than a few inmates come into jail with severe problems. One of the most difficult things I had to watch were men going through DTs. When a person is forced to detox off of whatever they're on, be it alcohol or hardcore drugs, it's brutal. There's always screaming, crying, shaking, vomiting. I'll stop there, but it does go on. Anyway, the deputies on my shift were just as much in a hurry to leave as I should have been. All I got was a brief rundown on the guy I was supposed to watch, an African-American male in his late 20s. He shouldn't get up or do anything. He's pretty wasted. Hearing that he was that wasted led me to believe he was coming down off something. As it would turn out, he wasn't. I unfolded what was left of my book and sat down. The guy I was watching was a mess. He was covered in what could best be described as bed sores. I'll save you the gory details. Now I considered myself a decent deputy. Not because I could lay someone out, but because I could talk them down. This guy suddenly regained consciousness, with a vengeance. He stood right up and walked around flailing his arms before losing his footing and bouncing off his bunk. I was gloved up, so I didn't hesitate to scoop him up and help him get back into bed. Keep in mind, he had wounds all over his body. Several of them had opened up. It was quite unpleasant. He got up a couple of other times during the time I watched him, Both times I told him to get back into bed, telling him the nurses were going to check in on him and he needed to keep still. Thankfully, he listened. 4 hours later, I was relieved, in more ways than one. I stripped off my latex gloves and went home, taking a shower and going to bed. I used that overtime money to go out to someplace nice to eat, or bought something I didn't need. A week or so later, I found out that guy had gotten into 2 dust-ups. Well, if you could call them that. Mainly, he had tried to stand up and swing on one of the deputies before falling again. Shortly after that, he became bedridden. Then, not long after that, he died from AIDS. No one had told me he was HIV positive. I didn't find out until 2 weeks later. As soon as I discovered this, I made sure my wife and I were both tested, and thank God we were both negative. 2 whole weeks I could have been an oblivious time bomb, one that could have ruined both our lives. I was a newlywed. My coworkers knew I was married, but not one of them bothered to warn me that he had AIDS. What if he had swung on me, hit me, busted my skin, and got his blood on me? My stupidity and the negligence of my coworkers could have caused my wife and I to contract a deadly disease. As time wore on with this job, the constant stress, fear, and sheer anger from it strained my relationship with my wife. She would later tell me that it had gotten so bad, she felt we were either going to get a divorce or I was going to wind up dead. So I made the best decision I could. I moved on, I went to college, and I never looked back. Not until later, that is. Whenever I think of my time behind those walls, a cold chill goes up my spine. When I think about all the what-ifs and look over at my beautiful wife, it terrifies me to this very day. I have trouble sleeping. I have since around 2001, and I'll probably have trouble sleeping for the rest of my life. So why tell you all this? Because there are things far more terrifying than some otherworldly paranormal monster hiding behind the corners of an abandoned building. One such terror is that of a sick man getting treated in a hospital, lying right in front of you in a brightly lit room. Rona Ghost, from Damien Y. When Corona hit the US back in late 2019, I was working at a small hospital in a rural central Minnesota town. I worked the night shift, 10:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was a phlebotomist at the hospital. I've worked in the healthcare field in various capacities and held various titles the last 25 years. I was used to working those hours and seeing weird things at night. But this experience was by far the weirdest, and I experienced this event with another person. It was mid-May 2020. The hospital reached COVID peak. Every room in the hospital was occupied by COVID patients. Since we were a small hospital, we only had 6 ICU beds. Of those 6 rooms, only 1 room came with an air filtration system. This room was our designated tuberculosis infection room for patients with active TB. By this time in the pandemic, it was clear that every room needed to have air filtration systems. We were in the process of installing the systems, which took time. So the worst patients were put in this one room for a couple of days. When they got better, we put them in a regular room. The COVID patients were rotating in and out of the ICU room, ICU 1. That particular morning, I was called to go draw the patient in ICU 1. Normally, we have a morning round, which started at 5:30, but the charge nurse wanted results for this patient before 5 a.m. She was making arrangements with an outside hospital for a possible transfer. After gowning up, I entered ICU 1. The room was larger than the other rooms on that floor because of its TB designation. And because of COVID, every furniture item in the room had been removed. The only things in the room were the patient in his bed, the 2 IV poles, a stainless steel hospital tray, and one of those PVC pipe chairs that the patient could sit on over a toilet. I turned on all the lights in the room. The curtain that normally covered the double sliding doors was pushed to one side. The room was bright and visible to anyone in the hallway. I introduced myself to the patient. He was awake, and he acknowledged my presence. He was already in a sitting position on his bed, so I didn't have to incline his head. I went ahead and pulled his bed up to my waist so I didn't have to bend down. This patient was an overweight man in his 60s. He wore an oxygen mask. The sound of the hissing oxygen was the background noise in the room. The air filtration system also made a low humming, continuous sound in the room too. Now, because he was a big man, it was difficult to find a vein in his left arm. In his right arm, he had 2 IV lines with running medication and fluids, so that arm was not suitable for a blood draw. So I continued to search for a vein in his left arm. The whole time, he watched me. We made eye contact a couple of times. I calmly told him what I was doing. Then, suddenly, the patient looked away towards the foot of his bed, as if a person had entered the room, taking his attention away from mine. I turned to look as well. A figure was standing there. I got the sense it was a female. They were slender, wearing blue hospital scrubs. I could tell her hair was blonde. As all this information formed in my head, I also knew that the figure was not real. The sliding door was closed as I had left it closed, and I had not heard a single person enter behind me. And the figure was not gowned up for room entry. I did a double take just in case, because the face was blurry, and I thought maybe my face shield was making me see weird reflections. I adjusted the shield. The figure was still there facing me. I didn't recognize it. I'd worked there for 13 years, and I knew just about everyone on that night shift. I looked at the patient then, and they looked at me. We stared at each other for a brief second as we both tried to comprehend the new entity in the room. Then I turned back to the figure, but it crouched down and disappeared. From where I stood beside the bed and the foot of the bed was only an arm's length away. I pulled the tourniquet loose from the patient's arm, pulling up the bedside rail and telling the patient to hold on for a second. Then I looked under the bed. I rounded the bed to the other side and looked under the bed again. Then I walked to the sliding door, peeking out into the darkened hallway. No one was there. There was no one out there at the nurse's station midway down the hall. I turned back to the room, just standing by the door, looking in. The room was bright. There was no place in it to hide. I surveyed the whole room still from one end to the other, and as I did, my patient watched me, his eyes wide. He was talking, but with the oxygen mask on, it was hard to understand what he was saying. After I was sure there was no one else in the room with us, I returned to the bedside and continued with the procedure. Then it happened again. The figure rose at the end of the bed. The patient's head swiveled to stare at the figure, and I did too. The figure ducked down again. I pulled the tourniquet, untied it from the patient's arm, quickly took a step back, and ducked down to see if I could catch the prick. Nothing. I stood there. My nerves were rattled a bit by then. I looked at my patient, sighed, and said, "I don't know what's going on, but I really do need to get your blood before the nurse bites my head off." I then returned to my task. Finally, I found a good vein. I concentrated on it, but I felt the presence of the figure at the foot of the bed. I felt it watching me. I wasn't nervous about being watched. I was very focused on getting the blood. The vein was very small. If I let my nervousness take over, I would have to start over. I would have to stay in that room even longer. And at that point, I was going to do everything within my power to get out of there as fast as possible. Halfway through the blood draw, the patient's gaze turned back to the foot of his bed. Without moving my head, I glanced sideways, and I saw the figure there. It was playing hide and seek with me. I was starting to feel uneasy, but mostly, I didn't want to have to poke the patient again. I put all my concentration into finishing the blood draw. After I was done, I labeled the blood tubes, taped up the patient, put his bed down, and patted the man's arm. Before turning to go, I said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what that was, but that was strange." The man only shrugged his shoulders at me. We stared at each other for a long few seconds. Then I exited the room, turned off the lights, degowned, and returned to the lab. I didn't feel the full effect of chills until I made it to the lab. I had no idea what that was. I didn't sense any malice in the entity's presence. But this wasn't the first time I experienced unexplainable occurrences at the hospital. And I never found out if that patient lived or died. Whenever I had to go back to that ICU room to do blood draws on patients, this event played back in my mind, making the hair on my neck stand up. My compilation of odd experiences. From Ami Delari. I am a female doctor in the spectrum, and as of now, I have worked in different places, both hospitals and clinics. And let me tell you something, there are tons of creepy sightings, either by workers, patients, or their families. Allow me to share some with you. The following few stories all happened at a hospital that I worked at. One night I was working on the computer at the doctor's lounge, making some follow-up notes on my patients. My coworkers were there as well. We were all cheerfully chatting and joking when a nurse came into the room and said, "I think the patient in bed 369 is having a heart attack. Can someone go check?" As I hadn't finished my work yet, my friends told me to stay, check the record, and they would call if they needed me. So I did that. They left the room and I immediately checked on the system to see what kind of patient we were dealing with. To my surprise, there was no one listed under bed 369. I must have misheard that bed number, I thought, so I sent a text to our group chat. Multiple people answered, 369. Weird, I thought. A few minutes passed and I didn't hear from them again. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a text. Someone else was asking for clarification on the bed number. I was puzzled. I texted back that it was 369. We'd all heard the same number, so we couldn't all be wrong, right? After some time, they came back and said there wasn't anyone in that bed. Someone even checked with the nurse station. They said there wasn't any patient in that bed since the day before, and at the moment, there was no patient in need of a doctor. When my friend described the nurse who called for assistance, the nurses at the station were all confused. There was no nurse employed here that matched that description. We were all perplexed and a bit annoyed because it was probably just a prank, but we never did figure it out for sure. Probably just a joke. I always had good luck, so my shifts would always be nice and quiet. On one night in particular, I was incredibly bored, so I went to the nurses' station to find someone to chat with. There, I found some nurses who were also bored as they finished their work, so I asked them about their scary experiences around the hospital. They all looked at each other and they say, "Yeah," in unison. "Do you really want to know?" one of them asked. "Of course," I responded back, eagerly. They all laughed at me. One of them said, "Okay, Doc, I've got one for you. During my first week working in here, my mentor told me this story to scare me. I thought she was trying to get me to quit, but she had a serious face while telling me." She continued to explain. Back in the 1950s, there was an inpatient at this very hospital named Jane. She fell extremely ill out of nowhere. Doctors could not understand what was going on. Several tests were conducted. Some empiric treatments were given. But there was no improvement to her condition. As the days went by, the woman kept getting worse and worse, but at the same time, things began to happen on the floor her room was on, the 3rd floor. The lights would go off at random times, then go back on. At some point, the other patients began to say they heard screams in the halls, but when the nurses would go and check, there would be no one to be found. No source to the screams. Later on, Jane stopped eating too. Her health worsened, but also the things got worse too. The patients around her would complain about screams, but now, somehow it all came from within Jane. People reported hearing 3 or 5 different voices coming from her throat. She would move and her bones would crack, making terrible noises. Her body would contort into awkward and unnatural positions. She would vomit blood and cry out loud for God to help her. But she never did receive the right help. Apparently, medicine and science couldn't help her. Her family asked for a priest to ask God to help her soul, either to save her or to end her pain. When the priest arrived, all the lights went out and horrible screaming would burst from within her, guttural, horrible screams. She said, Leave now. I can't take it. It doesn't want you here." She would squirm violently with pain. At some point, the priest got up and left, arguing that his presence there was not helping her condition. She needed special help, so he would ask his superiors for the authorization to perform an exorcism. Sadly, she didn't hang on that long. She died from organ failure due to chronic bleeding. At least, that was what the report said, but the nurses back then said her body just wouldn't hold what was in her. When the nurse finished that story, I was astounded. I lightheartedly said, "Let me guess, she was in the West Wing." "How do you know?" she asked. "Just a guess. That side of the hospital always gives me the creeps," I responded, remembering the thing about bed 369. "Well, you're right. She was in bed 360 or something along those lines." I didn't have time to properly think about what she said when another nurse added, "My turn to scare the doctor." And so she began her story. "I worked in the ER for a long time when I was younger, but my feet can't handle that anymore. I appreciate the calmness around here." She stopped herself. As context, at the hospital, it's pretty much forbidden to say calm when describing a shift because things can get pretty hectic out of nowhere. Everyone just stared daggers at her. "Anyway," she continued, "something that I'm pretty certain that did happen and probably still does in this hospital are the rounds from the nurse in black. I personally never saw her, but a lot of patients would tell me about her. They described her as always wearing her uniform, one exactly like ours, but all black. They would say that she was as beautiful as an angel, tall and slim, with perfect skin, green eyes, and long dark hair. She would sometimes appear walking from a door, checking on the patients inside, and she'd even talk to them. She would try to calm them, saying a little prayer, or simply uttering a few nice words. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Multiple patients reported seeing her, and they would mention her with great fondness. Even our isolated patients sometimes mentioned seeing her. The thing is, there wasn't anyone that worked here that looked like that, and there is no black uniform allowed here. But the scary part is, the patients that prayed with her would die a few days after. Not from awfully scary things, but some of them were okay one day and the next their condition would worsen. As I said, I never saw her myself, but a coworker of mine swears he did. I don't want to know anything about her, to be honest. As she finished the story, they all nodded in an "I feel you" kind of way, which was probably the creepiest part. Then a young nurse that joined us halfway through said, "Oh, I have one too. Probably all of you have experienced this by now, but it just happened to me a few days ago. I feel like I need to get it off my chest," she said in a sheepish voice. "As some of you might know, I've been working here for a few months now. I've been stationed at the hematology department in the pediatric wing, and since I'm the newbie, I only get night shifts, so it's been crazy. I mean, I don't mind the long, boring hours, but the laughs. Man, those laughs." She grabbed her head in her hands. "It's been too much sometimes. I hate scary movies because I'm so jumpy, so this sometimes feels like a bad joke from the universe. Sometimes things I leave in certain places will disappear and reappear somewhere else. Then I hear sounds, kids laughing at hours they shouldn't be playing, balls bouncing without anyone being around, the playground area moving on its own. Just the other day, the head nurse called me to her office because there was a complaint about some kids running in the hallway. When I told her I only had one kid admitted, whom I knew was sleeping with his mom at the time, she only told me to keep them quiet, then proceeded to send me on my way. What was I supposed to do? Ground a ghost kid for eternity? I'm ashamed to say I'm scared of my job. I mean, I love kids and all that, but not those kinds of kids. The nurses around her reassured her, and just like that, we finished our little storytelling session. By then, we had rounds to do. The days passed on, everything seemed normal, seeing normal patients, except for the woman who tried to hit me, saying we weren't even trying to fix her father, but she didn't understand that what we were doing was the proper treatment, and he was nearly ready to be discharged. But oh well. One night during my rounds, I asked one of my patients how she was feeling. She broke her hip, and due to her age and numerous illnesses, she wasn't a candidate for surgical repair of the damage. She said she was okay, but she was sick of the children. Obviously, I asked her what she meant. After all, there were no kids allowed in that area. Then she told me,
"The children, the kids that were making noises, loud noises. They were jumping and running around my bed, and when they saw you coming, they hid under the bed."
I knew there weren't any kids, because I would have seen them on the way in. But to make her happy, I checked under her bed. But I didn't see anything. I told her the kids weren't in here anymore. And that made her happy, I guess. I of course checked to see if she had other symptoms of delirium, a condition in which you'd sense things that aren't there, which was common in her state. But no, she seemed mentally fine beyond that. Curiously, they did bother her again. That wasn't the only time that patients complained about the children hiding under their beds. This happened at least 4 times in different floors and different wings. A few months later, I began working at an early stimulation center, a place for kids under 5 years old to develop their potential, and where rehabilitation was given to the ones who needed it, whether they needed help with their speech, movement, or anything else. It was pretty awesome what people did in there. In fact, every assignment was amazing, except mine. I would only check on kids or their parents if they were feeling sick, which meant a few runny noses per week if anything. So I'd always wander the halls trying to be useful in some way. I learned a lot about different kinds of therapy. I would always ask the therapists if I could observe their sessions and ask questions about their experience with one thing or another. That helped me keep going for a few months, and it was the reason I didn't quit earlier. One day I was scrolling through my phone when out of nowhere I heard someone screaming. Then I saw the head therapist running through the main hall while screaming at the top of her lungs. Of course, we all ran to see what was up. She was crying hysterically, but she managed to say between sobs, "I was finishing my paperwork, my room was all empty. Then out of nowhere I hear a little kid's voice say to me, 'Can we play?' I was confused, so I checked under my desk, even though I knew no one was there. Then I heard a ball bouncing a few feet away from me, so I ran, and here I am now." We were all astonished at her story. Just a few weeks after this, I was walking to a meeting that was about to start in the conference room. I then realized I forgot my phone in my office, so I quickly went back to grab it. But just as I was about to enter my office, I heard clear as day a child's voice say, "Doctor." I paid it no mind and grabbed my phone anyways, until I realized that since all the staff was in the meeting, and there was no children in the facilities at the time, I shouldn't be hearing a child's voice. So I started to check around to see where the voice came from. It sounded a lot like it came from the same room where the head therapist had gotten frightened. But the room was closed at the moment, and there was no one in there. There was a window pane in the door, so I could see inside, and the lights were all on, so it'd be obvious if someone was in there. But I didn't see a soul. At that point, I was thinking, weird. Later on, I asked the staff if there were any children for any reason in there, but I got the same answer from everyone. No. So if you ask me now, yes, a ghost talked to me, and the only thing I thought was, nope, probably not talking to me. After all, the voice said doctor. This was in Mexico, and the female term would have been doctora if referring to me, so I had assumed that they weren't talking to me. At some point in my life, I had to do some volunteering, as it was mandatory in order for me to graduate. Hence, I worked at a rural hospital as a medical resident for some time. It was an incredibly creepy place. Some rooms gave me the chills more than others, but they were all creepy, especially at night, since it had pretty bad lighting. I mean, that's probably the reason I saw shadows sometimes at the corner of my eye, right? It's quite normal to see shadows of people walking, even when I know for a fact no one else is around, I hope. That's probably the reason why I didn't even flinch when one of the nurses told me she took a selfie and saw a shadow person appearing in the image behind her. It was exactly that, the complete silhouette of a person standing right next to her. As we were looking at this creepy selfie and trying to see it better, her phone just died. Its battery was drained. Then of course she realized she didn't have her charger with her, which was just bad luck. The next time I saw her, I asked about the picture, and she told me she deleted it because her husband told her it was bad juju. A few nights after that, I was pretty busy, doing nothing during my shift. It was around 4 a.m., which meant I usually had nothing to do at the hour. People usually wait till the end of my shift to arrive. All alone and bored, I went to check if there was anyone waiting to be assigned to me. Plus, sometimes the guy at the registration office would fall asleep. When I got there, I saw a guy patiently waiting and sitting there. Excuse me, can I help you? I asked. Oh, hi, doctor, he answered in a cheerful voice. Yes, my brother is outside. I had a hard time getting him in the car. It's a small one, you know, and his leg is dangling in an awful, unnatural way. It hurts him too. His hip is broken or something, and any movement is too much pain for him. Can you please come out to the parking lot to check on him? I'm exhausted from all the acrobatics we had to do to get him inside the car. He finished with a smile. Now, that seemed weird. I mean, I wouldn't be smiling if my brother had a broken leg and was in pain. Also, his voice, it was overly sweet and calm. The best way I could describe it was a performance. As he said all of this, I was having a soliloquy in my head. I was thinking, yeah, dude, of course I would go outside to the dark parking lot without anyone else around. Would you like my phone and ID while I'm at it? I could even tie myself up for you too. Now, I may have some filter when I talk, but my face doesn't lie. I was never a good liar because my face always gave it away. As politely as I could, I said, Sir, it's forbidden that I go out while working. There are cameras everywhere and I could get fired. But he's in pain. Yes, but I can't even check on him in there, can I? I retorted, which was true. But I can't move him. It was a pain to get him in there. Just come with me, please, and see what it is, he said, beginning to lose his cool and fake sweetness. I'll get a nurse to help you, don't worry. A woman won't help much, he said. Don't worry, he is a big and strong guy, and he'll be able to do it without breaking a sweat. I then left, walking backwards as to keep an eye on him, and just as I did, he went outside. I calmly explained everything to my coworkers, and they went to check where I found the man. But he was gone. The car that had been in the parking lot was no longer there, but I did see the security guy doing his rounds. He came inside and I went over to talk to him. Right away he told me please not to go outside. He explained he saw a shady guy waiting near a car while another man entered the clinic. Now, I might be wrong, doctor, but the guy standing outside was hiding in the dark by the car, and at some point, the one who went inside came rushing back out
and they both got in and sped away. I asked him, was there anyone inside the car? No, he responded. And the guy in the dark, did he seem injured or? I don't know, but he ran quite fast. Does that count? Yes, it did, because my intuition was correct apparently, and because I wouldn't probably be here writing this right now if I'd gone outside with that man. Thankfully, those days were over in a blink of an eye, and I went back to the city to work in a different clinic, which didn't have night shifts, thank God. In that place, I met a man who told me a weird story. I don't know if it's true, but he seemed to believe it. He didn't have any records of mental illness, and to be honest, I didn't think he was schizophrenic, nor a drug user or anything like it. He was just scared. Also, it didn't happen only to him, it happened to his wife too, according to both of them. This is what he told me. I think I'm going crazy. I don't know what to think. I might be losing my mind, I guess. When he started, he had a pained look on his face. I've been having some extremely odd nights for a few weeks now. It started as nothing and I thought I was overreacting. I even took my cat outside of my room at night and he'd cry all night to be let back inside. But it still didn't stop. I don't know, I just don't know. My wife and I were getting these marks on our skin that looked like scratches. We thought it was the cat, although he never did that before. But I guess he could have started at some point, right? But when I left him outside our room for a while, it got worse. We both would get scratches all over our bodies. My wife would get them deeper and larger. I just don't know how to help her. Things get moved from one place to another too, without us noticing at first. Then the sounds. Ugh, am I going crazy? That was a hard one for sure. I still don't know what to think of it, to be honest. I guess I wasn't the right help he needed. He seemed healthy according to the psych evaluation, so I want to believe what he was saying. When I met my girlfriend Nadia, we'd hang out all the time. We were a happy young couple, but then out of nowhere, boom, COVID. So as an excuse to be able to spend some time together during the pandemic, we worked from home some days. Since she's also an MD, we organized ourselves a room at her house as our station, and we'd attend phone calls or video chats with patients to do follow-ups. If needed, we would check on them in person, or refer them to the hospital. At first, nothing weird happened at her house, probably because we were too busy in our own little world. But I always felt uneasy at her house. I'm as awkward as I can be, so at first I thought that was it. When I visit her home, even now, sometimes I feel watched, like if something was looking over my shoulder. Plus, I sometimes feel this presence staring at me. It was and still is utterly creepy. I can't tell her these kinds of things because she gets super creeped out, and then she gets anxious. So to keep her sanity intact, I try to keep it all to myself. But not too long ago, Nadia asked me out of nowhere if I thought there was something at her grandma's, because that house always creeped her out. Therefore, I told her I did feel uneasy, especially towards one of the rooms. It feels kinda weird, I told her. It gives me goosebumps and I can't keep myself from staring at its closed door every once in a while. It just feels wrong. I don't know how to put it otherwise, I explained while remembering the feeling and shuddering. She stared at me for a moment, then replied, "Well, I'll tell you a story. It happened to my granny a few years back. I'm not quite sure if it's real or not, but she always looked scared when she tells this story. One night she was sleeping in her room when suddenly she felt a presence at the foot of her bed. She woke up thinking that one of her kids were there, waiting for permission to crawl into bed with her. Then she sat on the bed and tiredly rubbed her eyes. As she opened them, she saw some thing. There was what she described as a monkey-like creature with a tail that ended in a pointy arrow, and it had tiny horns. It stared at her with red glowing eyes. She yelled as loud as she could, and her eldest son came rushing up to the room. But when he came in,
the thing was already gone. Ever since that day, she never slept in that room again, not once. I was speechless, trying to imagine all that. About to ask 100 different questions, then she asked me if I felt anything at her house. Since I was already hyped up on the subject, I told her how I always felt weird in the dining room, like if someone was staring at me from the living room, poking its head from the doorstep. As I told her this, her mom entered the room, and my girlfriend asked her if she felt anything supernatural in the house. Her mom told her exactly what I said, almost word for word. I think that her mom might be sensitive too. Months before this happened, my mother-in-law and I were preparing dinner, and we both heard a voice from the laundry room. It was some sort of scream. We both looked, and there was nothing. No one. We knew prior that it was empty, but we still checked anyway, and we still saw nothing. We stared at one another. Then she asked, "You heard that, right?" And I told her I did. I clearly did. On another occasion, something similar happened, but this time we heard the door opening and closing in my girlfriend's room. There was no one there again. Nadia was outside with her brother, so there was no one there to be opening and closing doors like that. So yeah, we just closed the door and kept prepping our dinner. Some time ago, I was in Nadia's room just hanging out, checking my phone. I began to hear some strange noises. It was subtle at first, so I automatically thought it was the current from the fan. No big deal. But then it grew a bit louder, so I turned my head to the place I heard it, and it stopped just as fast as it started. I still paid no mind to this, and I went back to my phone. But then I heard some weirder noise. It sounded like metal against metal, like if the USB cables from the chargers were rustling. So again, I looked up, yet I saw nothing weird. Of course, I got scared, thinking there might be some sort of uninvited guest, the kind that makes my heart pound, my skin crawl, and my blood rush, a mouse. The truth is, I'm a 5'6" baby when it comes to mice. When I told Nadia about it, it went like this. "Hey, I have to tell you something. I don't want you to get scared, but I can't keep this to myself anymore," I admitted, being as extra as I could. We joke like that all the time. She cut me off midway, saying, "I know. I didn't want to confront this nor acknowledge it, but I can't keep pretending it's not happening." I was like, dang, so she knows about it. She explained, "The other day when we were napping, I got really scared. I woke up due to some noise. It sounded like someone saying something. I don't remember if it was my name or your name it called, but I felt it in my ear, low but clear, and it tickled." When she said that, I opened my eyes like a deer in headlights. I mean, I was talking about a tiny mouse or maybe even a rat, not that. She looked at me sheepishly and scared all at once, so I told her it was probably just a nightmare. Yesterday, she was looking for something in her brother's room. She started to hear some weird noises in the room. Again, there was no one else there, nor in the house at all for that matter. Their chihuahua was soundly asleep, and there is only one bed and one closet inside that room. She told me it was super odd because it sounded like what monsters sound like in the movies, like a low and deep growl. Being completely honest, I don't know how to describe the sound it made. Did I mention that her father kept her grandfather's hospital bed in her room for a while after he passed? He had been average height, slim, sort of like what I perceive from the corner of my eye. I wonder if that has to do with anything. Or am I just crazy?
Paranormal Hospital Experience, submitted by Stephanie. When I was 15, my grandmother got lung cancer. It was very hard for my family to accept it. She was the soul of our family. Before she passed on, though, they tried to do a surgery on her to keep her alive longer. As she was recovering, they had her in the ICU. She wasn't coherent at the time, so when we'd go visit her, all we could do was talk to her or hold her hand. Right before she became better, my mother and I went to do our normal night shift visit. The ward was quiet. From what I remember, there were very few patients and nurses there. My grandmother's room was across from a nurse's station. My mother needed to use the bathroom. When she walked off, I sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed, holding her hand and telling her to hurry back to us, that it wasn't her time yet. And that's when I heard it. It was groaning as if someone was in pain. At first, I just brushed it off. It wasn't constant, it was in bursts. Sometimes they were low in volume, and then a really loud groan. I started to get a sick feeling in my gut, so I got off the bed and walked to the glass sliding door of the room. When I peeked out, I saw nothing, just one nurse at her station. There were barely any patients, so I went back to my grandma when I heard it again. But this time it sounded angry. I was thinking to myself, surely the nurses wouldn't just leave a patient in pain like that, would they? When I poked my head out for the second time, that's when I noticed it. An older man was in the room next to us. I could hear his funny breathing, like he had a horrible lung infection. I saw my mother walking back into the room, but I never said anything to her. A few days after that, my grandmother left the hospital. She was sitting in her favorite recliner, and out of nowhere she said this: "Your grandfather visited me in the hospital. He wanted me to come home, but I told him I'm not ready yet." I thought to myself I was scared. When I told my mother about it, she just stared at me. I was confused. When I asked my mother's sister about it, she said that my grandmother's husband died before I was ever born. He died from a horrible bacterial infection in his lungs. The Ghost from the Hospital. Submitted by Earthcake. This happened a few years ago when I was 3 years old. Me, my mother, and my father, and some of my cousins on my dad's side of the family went to the river near my dad's home and decided to have some fun. Despite the fact that it was cloudy and that the water's color is brown due to the weather, we had fun anyways. I accidentally drank some dirty brown water from the river. I know, it's a stupid thing to do, but hey, I was a kid. I think we were all kids at times, and you can't blame us for that. So anyway, it took about an hour and a half before we finally left. I began to experience some bad things with my body, such as diarrhea and dehydration. My mother ended up bringing me to a clinic for a checkup, but after the checkup, the doctor told my mom that I have dirty water in my system and a lot of bacteria. So my mom took me to the hospital, and I was supposed to stay there for a while. I can't remember why, but this affected my right foot somehow. Mainly, the only good part about the situation was I always smelled fresh chicken from my favorite restaurant nearby. But it only took my first night there to begin hating all of it. The room I was in was an empty room that only had the patient's bed and things the patients need, a few chairs and the like. But that wasn't the only reason I hated it there. I kept hearing a little girl giggle, and I would always hear her running all around the room. This happened to me at night, always around 7 to 8 p.m. One time I remember her saying, "Hello there, do you want to be friends?" I wanted to get the nurse, but I couldn't move. The girl then asked the same question, but her tone changed, as if she was screaming to an old person who could barely hear. I did not want to infuriate her, so I said, "Yes, fine, whatever." I forgot to mention before, but there was an old TV in the wall right across from my bed. Then it suddenly turned on at that moment. What showed up will forever scare me. It was a girl who was wearing a pinkish white t-shirt. She had pink overalls, followed by pink shoes and a pink dress. She was holding a pinkish white teddy bear that looked to be covered in stains, maybe even blood. The screen showed her head, but it was too dark to see her face. She was wearing a ponytail, and there seemed to be fire all around her. She walked closer to the screen and she revealed her face, which wasn't much of a face. It was a skull that had two eyes looking at different directions, with bloody and yellow teeth. She laughed, shaking her head. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. And then everything went back. I'm not sure if that was a dream, because it felt very, very real. But I know what happened next was a dream, while I was knocked out. I was in the middle of a field, and it was pretty much 3 in the afternoon. I saw a small farmhouse and walked up to it. I knocked at the door, and a girl opened the door. It was the same girl from the TV, but this time she had a face with a big smile. She looked very cute and friendly. She said, "I knew you wouldn't be a liar." I didn't understand, and I asked, "What are you talking about?" Her smile faded a bit, and then she giggled and said, "Aw, you're so forgetful," and then giggled again. Then it came back to me that she had asked if I wanted to play with her, and I said, "Oh, you asked if I could play, right?" Her smile grew bigger and screamed the words, "That's it, you remember." I moved my head away a bit because her voice was so loud, and then I whispered, "Sorry, I forgot." She invited me inside and we played with each other, which seemed like 4 hours. Then finally we heard knocking at the door. The girl told me to hide under her bed. Then she opened the door and there was this man that appeared. She called him Dad, and her dad called her daughter instead of a name. Her dad then said, "Who were you talking to?" Then the girl said, "My imaginary friend." Her dad just laughed and said, "All right, just avoid being reckless, okay?" Then she said, "Yes, sir," and her dad kept on laughing and laughed. She checked on me and said bye, and I said, "What do you mean?" Then just as I was about to finish my sentence, a man kicked down the door, grabbed her by the hair and pulled her away. Luckily, though, he didn't see me. I stayed there quietly until I heard screaming outside. I scanned the room and listened carefully, trying to find out if it was safe to get out, and the coast was clear. I ended up looking through the window, and I saw her tied up and being burned alive. It was only her head that was burning, and then her dad ran outside rushing to save her. I saw him carrying a hose and putting out her daughter's flaming head, and he began to beat the intruder who had burned his daughter with a rock. She was barely alive, and then I woke up. A nurse was checking on me. I don't know about all of this. I know for a fact that I did not dream her laughing or running across my room, but what happened with the TV and the dream after that, I'm not entirely sure. But I do know that I'm afraid that she could come back to haunt me again. Haunted Hospital, submitted by Haunted by Ghosts. So this happened about 2 months ago. While I was working at the hospital that was being shut down, the nurses and other workers told me and the younger employees to never go to the second and third floor alone. I soon found why, because we were there on a late night helping other nurses. While I was checking the rooms to make sure we got everything out, I saw a figure go into a room at the end of the hall, and when I got there was no one inside. Another coworker I worked with came up and said that people needed us, and right at the end of the hallway the call light to the room turned on. If anyone knows anything about hospitals, it's that someone from the room needs to press a button for assistance and that light comes on. This really freaked everybody out, especially myself, because we didn't see anyone in the room. Throughout that week I have seen shadows, lights turning on. I could hear knocking on the doors and walls, and I could never shake this weird feeling. The doctors and nurses have told me that the second floor, which is where they kept the babies, that sometimes you could hear a child cry. But I never believed the crying baby stories. I thought they were trying to scare me. But at 3 a.m. while working late one night, I did hear the faint sound of a child moaning. All the people there that night were adults and teens who were helping out, the youngest being 16, so no one could have made that sound. I remember running to the stairs and seeing someone there through the little window of the door, but they weren't there at all when I went inside. I knew once I got there that I might make sense of something since I can sense emotion easily. I always had this feeling when someone was in the same room with me and I didn't know it. Well, now they are tearing down that old building as we speak, and I wondered that maybe they were trying to scare people to go away. I've read that this happens when a ghost's home or building is being destroyed, and maybe they were trying to protect it. 2 weeks in a psych hospital. Submitted by Yoms Dev. I was a 22-year-old male with some serious emotional imbalances a couple of summers ago. Eventually, my doctor decided I was too much of a threat to my family, and especially to myself, and I was flown to the nearest nut house to stabilize. After a very rough few days, I started to level out, and I was allowed to leave the building unsupervised for up to an hour or two at a time. After 2 weeks, I was finally discharged. During one of my breaks outside, though, about 5 days in, a man passed me and approached the hospital outside garden area. He was bald, average height, slightly heavy in build. He began to speak with one of the patients from my ward, who I'd spoken with a couple of times. From my understanding, she was a recovering drug addict who was not coping too well at all. Their conversation got pretty heated, and suddenly the bald dude started screaming and crying about how they had to let the woman out of the hospital. She tried to calm him down, but he raved about how he would get her out. Pacing back and forth, he yelled something that shook me pretty bad. I'm going to burn this place to the freaking ground. Now, based on what I knew of the lady and how this guy was acting and crying, I completely believed his threat. I was just starting to get back under control, and this guy wanted to burn down the hospital I was staying in. He just kept screaming about how he'd be back and how the doctors or hospital or whatever would pay. Eventually, though, he tired himself out, and she managed to calm him down, and they began to speak somewhere else. Fast forward to my last day, and save for a few screaming patients and a middle-class dickhead arriving, my remaining time was very uneventful, exactly what I had needed, save for the last night of me sleeping in that place. I oddly woke up around 1 in the morning to the sounds of staff talking to a voice I did not recognize. I got up reluctantly, and I watched as they took a new guy in to sleep in the bed next to mine. The moment the nurse left the dorm, this dude was full on talking to someone I could not see. Anytime a staff member walked in, he'd stop, and for the most part talk normally with them. But when they would leave, he'd resume talking with this invisible person. Apparently, the people where I'm from, it's a tiny island, it's why I was flown in, were out to get him. This dude was also talking some seriously weird conspiracy theory stuff, and my home island was at the center of it. I avoided this guy like my life depended on it. The last thing I wanted was for him to find out where I was from, and thinking I was some kind of spy. The next morning, the day of my discharge, I woke to the sound of running water. Weird, I thought. I could also hear the new guy next to me still telling whoever or whatever about this great conspiracy. Alright, I thought. I didn't imagine that part then. I eventually got up and sat at the side of my bed, feet on the ground. The cold, wet ground. I looked under my bed and there was water going from the bathroom door to halfway under my bed. What the actual hell? This guy had turned on like 4 taps at once and let them all overflow. I gathered my stuff on my bed, got dressed, and avoided that man the rest of the day. In fact, before I ever went home, I avoided that dorm altogether. Most of the people I met during those 2 weeks were delightful company. That bald guy and the conspiracy dude and whoever or whatever he was talking to, however, gave me nightmares for days and even weeks after. My current situation. Submitted by Sophie. Let me start by telling you about where I am. I know that the place that I am in used to be a tuberculosis hospital, as many of the good haunted ones seem to have been. My great-grandfather was a patient here back in the days, but now I'm here for something completely different. Needless to say, the TB hospital had a lot of patients that did not get the care that was needed, and a lot of them died within a short time. When the tuberculosis epidemic had come under control, the city suddenly had a huge castle that was standing empty, and soon enough, it was decided that this would be a good place for the mentally ill. Renovations were made, but it did little to remove the gloom that surrounded the whole place. Fast forward to about a week ago, I finally gave up after fighting depression for the past 13 years. Luckily, my aunt was there to drag my sorry ass to the local asylum. I get settled in, and to be honest, most of that day was a blur to me, as I'm sure it must be for most people. By the time I am finally at ease in my room, and the night nurse has been by with something relaxing to help me sleep, I turn to my side, facing the wall, and curl up into a ball. I had cried too much that day to cry myself to sleep, and I soon enough found a pleasant numbness in my mind that I could focus on. I don't know how long I did sleep, but I woke up when I felt a shift in my bed. Now, I'm a big sister whose little brother used to sneak in to sleep with me when he was scared, so this was a pretty familiar feeling, like a person getting into your bed carefully. I laid still, holding my breath as I felt breathing on my neck. If I was asleep, it wouldn't hurt me, right? That was the wrong way to think. I felt fingers close around my neck, effectively cutting off my air supply, and I finally snapped out of it. I swung around to push whomever was in my bed away. You might be thinking, but I was suicidal. That's different. This is completely different. I don't think anyone wants to be murdered, and I was not going to let some random person take my life. As I leapt for the light, I found that I was alone in my room. I suffer from depression. I have no delusions or hallucinations, so I know that couldn't have been it. But I also know that I've been accustomed to paranormal things throughout my life. It was something that me and my grandmother shared, a sort of sensitivity, if you will. Luckily, the next day I was moved to another ward. My new room used to house somebody with a psychosis. There's all sorts of strange things scribbled on the walls. Things that will probably make sense to the poor thing before me, but to me it means nothing other than something interesting. In the end, I find myself relaxed. In this new room, I didn't feel watched, and I was honestly hoping for a good night's sleep. Once again, I was wrong. In this room, nothing gets into bed with me, but the sound of footsteps echo in my room constantly, like there was somebody pacing around my room. Again, I was moved. That happened yesterday. So I am technically in my third room. Third time's the charm, right? So far, nothing has happened inside of this room, and I hope that it will stay like that. But last night when my friend visited me, she shushed me before asking if I heard the sound of children singing. Scared and confused, I replied with no, because I hadn't. Listen closely, she said, and dragged me closer to my window, and sure enough, I did pick up on a faint sound, but it did not sound like singing to me. The whistling? I asked, but she looked at me like I was some sort of idiot. But in the end, we agreed that the ghosts of the former patients had gotten together to make the afterlife a bit more bearable. Still though, I hope that nothing will come for me tonight.
Staying overnight in a hospital. From Kristen. Location unknown. My grandma has multiple sclerosis, and due to that, she can't move from the shoulders down. She can talk normally and move her head, but that's about the extent of it. Luckily, she has a fantastic attitude though, and she's witty and loves to joke around. She has 24/7 hospice care, helpers from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., and she lives with my aunt who cares for her as well. One day my mom texts me, telling me my grandma is in the hospital with an infection, and they need someone to stay with her overnight. My aunt has 3 kids at home, 2 of which are 5 and 3, that need to be ready for school every morning. My mom at the time had a truckload of personal items because she was moving to a new house my parents recently purchased, so she couldn't stay. Apparently, when my aunt left my grandma in the hospital room with the nurses to take a phone call, the nurses left too, though my grandma hadn't used the restroom yet, and no one would come back to check on her. So she had to wait in her waste until my aunt came back to the hospital to tell her. Again, she couldn't even move enough to press a button to call for help. After that, none of us felt that she should be left in the nurse's care or responsibility. So I volunteered to help out. I've stayed overnight with my grandmother before at her house, whenever my aunt was busy or going on vacation, or really just whenever they needed some help. My grandma snores like a bear, but it didn't bother me that much, and it felt good to be able to help out whenever I could, especially since I work so much. I worked in retail, so I worked until 9:30 p.m. every evening. I could get from the mall I worked at to the hospital in 15 minutes, so I knew I could be there before 10 when her last helper left. The next helper would be there at 8 a.m., and I worked at 9:30 a.m., so I figured I could get ready and make it to work on time. When I arrived, she seemed to be doing better, and I said goodnight to her helper. We watched a movie together, and throughout the movie, the nurses prepped her for bed, finishing the IV and leaving for the rest of the night at 12:30 a.m. She probably fell asleep about 15 to 20 minutes later. I was passing the time texting my fiancé, something about how uncomfortable my chair was to sleep in, and how I wished I remembered my pillow and blanket. While I was waiting for him to respond, the exhaustion from work that day and accidentally going to the wrong hospital next door before going to the right one caused me to doze off. Suddenly, I was startled awake. There were some abnormal noises coming from my grandmother's resting body. At first, it was like she was sleep-talking, but she wasn't saying normal words. It was almost like someone was flipping through channels on a TV. She would be talking normal, though the words I couldn't understand, and she would sing mid-sentence, then cut off and begin speaking normally again. It would happen for a couple of seconds, then stop every 30 minutes to an hour. I decided no one is going to believe me unless I recorded this. Then things got weird. She started making these weird noises with her mouth. Then she started to do something terrifying. She spoke in a creepy, deep voice that was not hers. I would even go as far as to say that a voice like that could not come from a woman's body. I was horrified, to say the least. I just told myself if she sits up or moves, I'm running out of here. So I stared at her with my eyes wide, trying to see everything in the pitch black room. Luckily, she never moved. The following day, I was feeding her breakfast, and I asked her how she slept. She said just fine, so I played her the recording I had from the night before, and she looked at me, scared and confused. "What was that?" she asked. I told her that it was her, and she had scared me herself. She laughed nervously and said she didn't remember that. And all of my nights taking care of her, she's never done this, and I wonder if anyone can explain this or help me understand better. My paranormal encounter at a nursing home. From Lil. Location unknown. Back when I was 19 years old and 6 months pregnant, I had recently got my CNA certification to work at a nursing home. I can't disclose the precise nursing home because it's still an active place and the residents don't need to be bothered. I was hired onto the overnight shift and started with 2 other girls. The turnover rate for CNAs on the night shift there was oddly high for the place, and I wasn't sure why at first. Now, there were 2 floors to the building, and 1 LPN and 2 nursing assistants to each floor at night. The bottom floor was a secure ward for the dementia and the Alzheimer's residents, and the upstairs were for the norms that just need to have round-the-clock care for various reasons. The main duties for the main floor were to answer call lights and to see what the resident needed at the time. The bottom floor duties were a lot more complicated than that. The main concern was to get all the residents back to bed. Sometimes they just needed a quick suggestion to lay back down, but sometimes they'd respond with an all-out freak-out. I was accidentally assigned to the bottom floor, but my coworkers agree that with the residents having the tendency to be violent, that I needed to be on the main floor, especially with my pregnancy. This night was orientation night, and the only assistant that wasn't new, who had started a couple of months ago, had to be the one to show us our duties. Let's call her Jane. She was a very bubbly and friendly person, and we all got along with her. She was one of those people that liked to scare everyone, and started to tell us about the history of the nursing home. She said it used to be a hospital a long time ago, and the area that the nursing home was on used to be the emergency ward. Jane claimed that there are ghosts residing in the building and told us stories of other workers seeing either a little girl, a former doctor, or a tall stranger walking around at night. The other gals were freaking out, but I didn't, as I had experienced living in a weird and supposedly haunted house when I was a child. I heard and saw plenty of creepy things, so I guess I was numbed or prepared for it. A ghost story at a nursing home was nothing compared to what I saw. Anyway, after that, we started the first few rounds of checking on residents. I won't bore you with the details, but we had to do rounds every 2 hours and check on each resident. Now, at about midnight, Jane decided to scare the 2 newest gals I was excluded thanks to my pregnancy. She claimed that there was a ghost in the sunroom at the end of the bottom floor. I don't know why, but I got a weird feeling that they shouldn't go down there, and I insisted that they shouldn't explore it. Well, they did anyway, and when all three went down all the way to the sunroom, Jane grabbed their backs and freaked them out so badly that they screamed and ran back. Jane thanked me for building up the scare, but I didn't explain that I wasn't joking. There really was something off about that place. After that, weird things began happening around the nursing home. The first event was that doors began to open by themselves. For safety and privacy reasons, we always kept the doors closed during the night. The nurses grew annoyed and would remind us to close the doors, and then after a couple of hours of this happening, they began to demand to know who was forgetting to close the doors. As new CNAs, we were never alone, we were babysat, and those that were with us never forgot to close the doors. But that was just the beginning, because on round checks, random beds would be lifted on highest setting. This was when the nurses started to realize that this wasn't just some clumsy person, and it wasn't the residents. We all did rounds together, so there was no opportunity for us to do it without someone knowing. Then catheter bags would end up in random spots around the bed, and the feeling of being watched was felt by everyone at almost all times. It all came to a terrifying event that no one could explain to this day, and Jane doesn't even talk about it herself. At 3 a.m., I was finishing my last break. A pregnant woman has to eat. Then I walked out from the break room. The break room was at a corner area, and when you walk out, you can look to the left and see the main desk call station where we'd often sit, and if you look straight, you can see what we call the business hall. The business hall is the area where the administrator's offices are. Well, at night, the hall obviously didn't have the lights on to conserve electricity. As I was looking down the hallway, I saw a call light turn on. It was off, and with a blink it turned on. I was tired and didn't believe what was happening, so I went to the light board to see if the room light was on. Jane asked me what I was doing, and I told Jane I didn't know the room number of the call light that was on. She looked down both hallways and indicated that there wasn't a light on. I pointed to the business hallway, and she laughed, and she thought I was trying to scare her. So she humored me and went to go see what I saw. Not even a minute went by as she freaked out and ran to get the male nurse that was downstairs. Jane kept saying as she ran by, "It's not possible, that's not possible." Both nurses and nursing assistants all ran to see the call light on and apparently freaked out as well. After that, Jane, me, and the main nurse decided to keep me company to make sure the pregnant lady was safe from any more weird events. I never pointed out that I didn't freak out and was not scared to be alone, but people feel safer in groups. Everybody was too scared to investigate it further, and the light eventually did shut off around an hour later. At the end of the shift, Jane took me aside to explain it to me. There was no possible way for that light to switch on like that, because she had known for a fact that the buttons were disabled, and the lights weren't even supposed to have bulbs. Jane said when she walked into the room that the light indicated, she saw a shadow of a man walking down the hallway and into the room before she freaked out. The day after I was sent on bed rest due to pregnancy complications, and after I came back from maternity leave, everyone that I'd known on the CNA staff had already quit. I didn't make it too long after that, as the jobs were more than I could handle. The weird part is that the haunting of the place is kept as an unsaid agreement between the staff. We're not supposed to speak of it outside of work, probably because it scares away future staff. What disturbed me the most about my short time there wasn't the ghost or the care of the resident. In the back of the nursing home, there is a secure area where the door has locks on both sides. You need to get a key to go in or out. The first room is full of medicine and other medical supplies, but when going into the next room, it is packed full of past residents' used items, the personal possessions of those that were simply abandoned here until the day they rotted. They go into the nursing home with all the things they had throughout their lives, but they're only allowed to keep what fits in a couple of drawers in a closet. To this day, my biggest fear is ending up in a nursing home. I'd rather take my own life than sit there and pass away slowly like that, let alone in a haunted nursing home. One Creepy Night, from Steve Z. Location unknown. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I work housekeeping for a nursing home. Sometimes I'm asked to work third shift, which can sometimes be a 12-hour deal, from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. I'm a bit of a night owl though, so it doesn't bother me much. On October of 2016, our facility got hit with a nasty flu virus that was going around. The elderly are more at risk here, obviously, so we sadly lost a few of our residents because of it. Now, for those who have never worked in hospitals or nursing homes, let me tell you that these hauntings are very real. I started my shift like usual, said hello to the few residents and staff that were out and about. It was late in the hour. As I'm about to go into the basement through the central stairwell, I type in the code and begin to open the door. I see someone pass behind it, as if they were waiting for me to open it, and as I pause to see who it is, I find that the stairwell is actually empty. In my confusion, I suddenly hear a raspy. It was close enough to my ear to feel someone's breath, yet the hallway was empty. I brush it off, thinking, or rather hoping, it was one of the nurses playing a prank on me. I continue on with my shift, and for a few hours it's uneventful. That changed when it hit 3 a.m. I had just finished cleaning up the restrooms on the first floor when I hear the buzzer for a call light go off. I look down the hall to see the light flashing. It was coming from a room that I know had no one in it, as that resident had moved out earlier in the day. The nurse on duty goes in, shuts off the call light, and closes the door as she leaves the room. She gets halfway down the hall to talk to me when that exact same light goes off again. We both go into the room this time to investigate and find nothing except the fresh smell of a cigar. We're a strict no-smoking facility, so no one had smoked in there in decades. I rub my eyes and go into the kitchen to grab some well-needed coffee from the machine there. Before they leave for the night, the kitchen staff usually sets up a couple of fresh brewed pots for us late shifters. As I get my cup and start to fill it, I hear a metallic crash from over in front of the ovens. A pan lid was wobbling on the floor as if it was slowing down after being spun like a top. Now, I know the kitchen staff pretty well, as I had been in that department for a few years before transferring to housekeeping. I know where they kept the lids, on the opposite side of the kitchen and behind a wall from where the ovens are. For this lid to have gotten where it landed, it would have to fly around the wall and pass through a rack of large utensils, and even then, it would not have landed with the force that it did. Most times, I don't get bothered by the antics of what the staff calls the prankster ghost, but having seen something get thrown around like that, it's not something I'm going to get used to. Not much else of note happened during the rest of my shift, but as I was clocking out that morning, I bumped into the head nurse. She mentioned that we had lost several of our long-term residents that night, so maybe the events I witnessed there, it was their way of saying goodbye. The hallway light flickered as she told me this. Dark Entity, from Dark Rose, location unknown. I work at a nursing home and rehab home as a nursing assistant. We have 2 sections of our building. Side 2 is rehab. It's mainly for patients with hip replacements and things like that. Section 1, the place I work, deals with more permanent patients, like those with Alzheimer's and dementia. I work the 3 to 11 shift, but at the time of this happening, I work the 11 to 7, otherwise known as the graveyard shift. I've worked in this building for many years, and I've seen a number of strange things happen. My building is also close to 5 decades old, so this does help the creep factor. My section has 4 halls with a large nurses' station in the middle. It's nice because you can sit at the nurses' station and look down the hallways. This helps out a lot at night when you have paperwork to do and call lights keep going off, which never fails to happen. However, this night had been the Q word. Nurses do not like saying the word quiet, because once you do, all you-know-what breaks loose. This night was no exception. On the graveyard shift, my building is usually staffed with at least 3 assistants and 2 nurses. Around 2:30 in the morning, one of the nursing assistants had commented on the lack of activity, calling it quiet. As she had used the Q word, we gave her a good thrashing about. Well, sure enough, about 5 minutes later, another nursing assistant that was finishing a bed check on her patients came up to us saying one of the patients was acting very odd. The nurse in charge of that hall, Hall 4, followed the assistant to the room she was talking about. A few minutes later, that nurse, Sarah, walked up to the other nurse, Ginny, and asked her to help her. A few minutes later, Ginny came out of the room and called the head nurse on staff. I watched her go in the room herself with our other assistant. By now, my curiosity had become piqued. I had to see what all the fuss was about, so I made my way to the room. I could hear the head nurse and the others calling the lady's name. The assistant who found her said, "She just keeps staring at things." That was unusual in itself because this lady always liked to talk. Her being quiet and just staring is completely out of character. As I listened outside the door, the head nurse decided that we needed to send her to the hospital. Maybe it's serious, I thought, so I decided to see if I could help in any way. As I began to walk through the threshold of the room, I got an eerie feeling. It actually made me stop at the entrance. I looked at the patient, and I won't forget the way she appeared. The staff surrounded her and slowly turned to look at me. As for her, her eyes bore into mine. I froze, unable to look away. Her eyes were usually welcoming, warm, but not today. Instead, they were cold, dare I even say sinister. This unforgettable, dark smile came across her face slowly, as if she had something devious in mind for me alone. She just kept staring into my eyes, not even blinking. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'd never got this feeling from another person before, a feeling of dread and fear. Even now, remembering it, I have goosebumps thinking about it. No, I said under my breath as I turned away from the room. There was no way I was going in there. I headed back to the nurse's station, and a few minutes later the EMT showed up. I stayed at the station but thought I heard her talking. I decided to put my big girl pants on and be brave. I walked back to the outside of the room and saw her talking to everyone. "I'm fine, I don't need to go," she replied, like nothing had ever happened. I was stunned. Her eyes were normal again, and she was talking. What had just happened? Had I imagined the whole thing? Even with all her pleading, they still took her to get checked out at the hospital. It was around 4 now, so I figured I'd get a jump start on my last round. Hall 6, which was straight across from Hall 4. I had started at the back of the home and was working my way toward the nurse's station, checking on patients. As it was the middle of the night, we try not to turn on too many lights, so we don't disturb everyone in the rooms. As I went room to room making sure my patients were okay, I feel like there's someone behind me. Of course, I would turn to see nothing, but this feeling would not leave me, almost like someone or something was following me. My grandmother always said if you feel uneasy, like there's something around you, all you have to do is tell it to back away in a stern voice, so I did this. It must have looked awkward seeing a girl standing in a dark hallway, telling thin air to leave her alone, but thank goodness no one was watching, as far as I know. This did help and the feeling went away. I breathed a sigh of relief and began walking down the hall towards the nurse's station. That's when, out of the silence, a deep, disembodied male scream began to boom. It sounded unnatural. It started low at the back of the hall, almost like a growl, then grew louder as it got closer to the front where I was. It flew past me like a wave, and then evaporated. Ginny and Sarah had been sitting at the nurse's station, facing Hall 6, and at the same time they both looked up at me as I was now frozen in the middle of the hallway. We all had a look of confusion and fear. "The heck was that?" Ginny asked. "That was a scream," Sarah stuttered out low. We tried to rationalize where it came from. I checked all my male patients, which was only 2. They were all fine, sound asleep, and we 3 just looked at each other. We didn't tell the other coworkers. We finished our night and went home as soon as we could. I did tell a few people about this later in life. Some people think it was a demonic entity or something worse that took control over the patient at a weakened state, then set its eyes on me. Whatever it was, I'm just glad I have the strength to fight it off. It watches us. From Lily. Location unknown. I'm currently pregnant with my first child, a boy that I'm quite grateful for. But the way he was conceived into this world and the things I've felt while pregnant have been anything but normal. At the end of April that year, I went into septic shock due to untreated sepsis and was admitted to the hospital just before it was too late. I also had high blood pressure, kidney failure, and was completely delusional. During my week-long stay, I was constantly in and out of sleep. I would wake up from nightmares. I would feel people touching me who weren't there, see things when I opened my eyes, and heard whispers. One night, I was startled awake from the sound of a big bang and people screaming, only to find pin-drop silence. It had to have been one of the longest weeks of my life. When May finally came, I was released on the 2nd. All tests they had taken came back negative, unable to determine the cause of the sepsis. My fiancé Alan and I decided to visit my sister and her husband, as they lived a few hours away. We were only there for a few days, and the day we drove back it was pouring rain. We ended up crashing into a state trooper who had someone pulled over on a curb. We lost our car to damages and had to pay a lot of money that we didn't have. The next few weeks went by as I was still recovering from almost perishing, and I was still shaken up from the crash. When I became late, a pregnancy test came back positive, and the local women's clinic confirmed it. My mom swears up and down that I got sepsis because my body overreacted to the implantation of the child, but that can't be proven. I was happy, but the timing was far from perfect, and there was so much to be done and so much on my mind. I still had to have hospital visits and was still well into recovery. Whenever I'd be alone, I'd get these overwhelming feelings of dread. It's like it roots itself to me wherever I'm sitting. I can't move or even think properly, like something was watching me, waiting for me to move into its sight. The first time this happened, I was lounging in bed, and I had the overwhelming feeling I shouldn't move within the view of the window above me. Another time, my parents' cat started freaking out for no reason, staring at the living room window. I heard a creak from outside the door, as if someone stepped onto one of the porch steps, but didn't take another step further. After a while, I hear them go away, but I have this feeling that someone or something wants me to go outside with it, within its grasp. A few days ago, Alan told me he had woken up the night prior around 5. Upon waking, he had the feeling that he shouldn't open his eyes, or he would see someone staring at him. After contemplating for a few minutes, he opened his right eye and saw a face. It was only there for a moment, but he definitely saw it. It was all white, with black shading around its eyes and smile. He was startled, but said he wasn't sure if it was malevolent. He wasn't afraid, but that contradicts how I felt about that thing outside. He thinks maybe that's preventing something from getting in at us, and maybe that something followed us from the hospital. Asylum Ghost, from Unique Angel, location unknown. When I was 12, I had some rough spots where I would freak out and have a panic attack and such. I ended up in a mental ward for a few weeks, and during my time there, I got to know people, and it was pretty common that people in this ward often took their own lives. Even for the short time I was there, a 9-year-old child who was there as well offed himself, all while everyone else was sleeping. Not to mention there were very strange goings-on, like hearing noises and people talking when the rooms would be empty. But nobody really stayed more than 5 days. One morning at breakfast, where all the patients eat together, I was sitting alone and waiting for my patient friends to come sit by me. I had attempted to hurt myself in the past, and I didn't believe in God whatsoever at the time. To me, if God was real, why would he let so many people suffer? That's the way I thought about it. Anyway, as I was eating, a girl who I'd never seen before came and stood next to me. I asked what her name was, but she didn't answer. She sat down and simply said my name once. I had never met her before, so I was confused. Maybe she had read it from my wristband. After an awkward moment, she looked at me, stared me in the eyes, and said this: "I OD'd. I was in a coma for 3 days. Something waits on the other side." "What do you mean?" I said, and blinked instinctively. The moment I blinked, the girl was gone. I quickly asked one of the RNs and all the other patients about who she was, but nobody knew her name, and nobody recognized her based off of her description, nor did anyone see her sit next to me. I never saw her again while I was there. I would have known about it if she had taken her own life as well, but no. She was like a voice in the wind, quiet and gone in moments. I'm not sure if she was an angel trying to give me hope, or a spirit warning me that I was wrong in the very worst way. Why I don't go into hospital morgues. From Your Creepy Uncle Jeff. I work in the field of funeral care. Specifically, I work for a company that picks up and transports the bodies of deceased loved ones from hospitals, homes, or anywhere else someone has died to the funeral home, where they'll be kept and processed until finally being put into the ground. I've been in this job for many years now, and honestly, I love it. I get to have a part in helping others during what is often one of the hardest and darkest moments in their lives. Some of the best calls I go on are the ones where the whole house is filled with grieving, crying people because you know that person was loved and will certainly be missed. Though the job is certainly rewarding,
It has its days that one could never forget. Like the day where a man had been found dead on his floor for days with his face melting into the heat register that he fell onto. Or the time a 650-pound woman was found in her room that had so much rancid food, the entire building was found to have a maggot infestation and had maggots falling onto us from the ceiling. Or the 15-year-old boy who hung himself because of his parents' daily reminders of how he wasn't the perfect daughter they always wanted. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. Work can be great, but it can leave dark spots in your memory forever. Getting to the story. One of the most common runs I find myself on is going to hospital morgues, taking out as many people as possible, and taking them to be delivered for embalming or cremation at the many funeral homes around the state. This particular hospital I've been to many times, so many in fact that I knew most of the security guards by name. The guard who came to meet me, who I'll call Jed, escorted me through the winding halls and maze-like labyrinth that seemed to make up the lower levels of hospitals. We talked about our lives, how work was treating us, and swapped stories of the crazy experiences that these jobs will occasionally bestow upon us. When we got to the morgue, I went through the usual procedures. Sign documentation, draw up ankle tags, put on gloves, confirm all the bodies are exactly who they're supposed to be. Typically, Jed will stay with me the whole time, in case I need any help moving someone, and to make sure that everything is locked up again when I leave. This time, though, Jed received a call on his radio about an angry woman who had just attempted to assault a nurse for telling her some information she didn't like. Jed told me he had to go, and that he'd be back as soon as possible. He rushed off and left me alone in the cooler. I didn't mind. Some people find being alone with dead bodies a very unnerving experience, always wary of the haunting gaze of their glazed-over dead eyes, but not me. I like talking to bodies, venting about my day, entrusting important secrets, or just simply telling them how good my lunch sounds, all of which falls onto ears that will never again be able to retell the words I impart to them. As I was detailing the lunch I would be having as soon as I got back to the van, I noticed a sound. It sounded like someone brushing against the plastic of the body bags that the bodies were stored in. I looked around the room, expecting Jed to maybe have come back, trying to startle me like he'd done numerous times before. There was no one else in the room, so I chalked it up to one of the fans rustling some of the plastic. I moved the first body without issue, but when I went to pull out the second one, I heard that sound again. It sounded just like someone slightly moving the plastic shrouds, but in a quiet way, like they were trying to keep me from noticing it. I decided to just load up this last body, and then to make my exit whether Jed was back or not. I opened the bag to compare my ankle tag with the one the hospitals put on the toe, when the lights began to flicker and the fans started to pulse and shudder. It lasted for a long moment. Then everything suddenly went dark and silent. I cursed in surprise, then began to slowly shuffle my way across the dark, cold room. I froze in my tracks when the silence was shattered by a quiet sound, seemingly amplified by the silence of that room. The sound of a zipper slowly unzipping from the back of the room. I internally screamed at my body to get to the door, to put as much distance between me and the sound as possible, but it refused to listen. The unnerving sound of the zipper cemented me into place. After a long, tense moment, the sound ceased. My mind was racing to come up with an explanation for the sound. Was it a prank? Perhaps another sound just misinterpreted in the dark room. My panicked thoughts were interrupted by another sound, plastic shifting. Then the slap of something smacking onto the floor. Control rushed back into my body as I heard footsteps slowly smacking one after another on the hard concrete floor. It was coming closer to me. I ran across the room, desperate to find the door and escape this new chilled prison, but the room seemed longer than it should have been. The further I ran, the faster and closer the footsteps sounded to fall. Just as the footsteps seemed to put whatever was chasing me just a few feet behind me, my feet seemed to just fly out from beneath me. I fell to the floor with a painful thud, and once again all sound ceased. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, waiting to hear something, anything that would tell me where the source of the sound had gone. The dark and cold were the only things my body could register for a few moments, before I became aware of the sensation of something hovering inches from my face. Once again, my body froze in terror of what unseen horror had placed itself directly in front of me. I felt an icy breath exhale onto my face, the stench of decay and death briefly overloading my senses as the wet sound of a mouth slowly opening began. I felt whatever it was lean closer toward me, just about to touch me, when the door to the cooler burst open. The room was suddenly flooded with light and the sound of fans whirring ceaselessly. Jed asked me if everything was okay as he looked into the room. I was sprawled across the floor, pale and breathless, with a body on the floor on the other side of the room. I told him I just tripped and fell as I was coming out to get him to help me pick up a body that I accidentally dropped. He laughed at me as we picked up and returned the fallen body to its crypt table. I loaded up my last body and bolted out and away from that hospital. I don't know what happened in that room. If it was a hallucination or if I was witnessing some kind of paranormal encounter, I don't know. I still work this job, and I still go to hospitals all over the state, but suffice to say, I don't go into any morgue coolers anymore without someone with me the entire time. I worked in a haunted hospital built in the 1800s. From Anonymous. I've been a nurse for about a decade now. My first job as an RN was at an old hospital that was built in the mid-1800s. The hospital had a really strange layout because it was built into the side of a hill. There were several floors that were basically abandoned, but had been left intact, just in case we ever needed them again. A couple of those floors were occasionally reopened as overflow units, but there was one specific floor that we never used for whatever reason. That part of the floor was completely inaccessible to the public, so there were never any patients or visitors around that area. About 6 months in, after switching to the night shift, I started hearing weird stories about that one floor. Because of the layout of the hospital, walking through that floor was actually a shortcut to get to our monitor room. The monitor room was a small office in an isolated part of the hospital, where techs would watch a live feed of all the heart monitors being worn by patients. I worked on a cardiac unit, so the monitor room was actually staffed by techs from my department. They all took turns going to the monitor room. Anyway, about 6 months in, I began hearing stories from people who had to walk through the abandoned floor. They would claim to see a little boy playing with a red ball, or just a red ball rolling down the hallway by itself, or a pregnant woman pushing a stroller. A few people claimed to have heard babies crying or kids laughing as they walked to the monitor room. At first, I thought it was odd that all their stories were about babies and children. Except for the ER, this hospital didn't even take care of kids, and hadn't for many years. We would just send any kids or pregnant patients in an ambulance to the nearest women's and children's hospital, rather than keep them at our facility. So I really didn't believe the creepy stories, even after I was promoted to charge nurse and had to start making trips to the monitor room, usually alone, to check on the techs. For several months, I never heard or saw anything strange. Eventually, I did some digging into the hospital's history. I found out that the abandoned floor had once been used for the maternity and pediatric wards, like way back in the 1800s to the early 1900s. I thought it was an interesting piece of history, and it gave a name to the old floor, but I still wasn't convinced that there were ghosts of little kids running around up there. Then, one night, I made a trip to the monitor room at about 3 a.m. As usual, I took a shortcut through the old pediatric ward. Everything was fine at first, until I had walked about halfway through the ward. Out of nowhere, as I was walking by a row of old patient rooms, I suddenly got the feeling I was being watched. My blood ran cold. About 10 feet in front of me, I noticed a door propped halfway open. I can't really explain it, but I felt a sense of dread, like I didn't want to walk by that room. I told myself it was nothing, and I kept walking forward. As I passed the room with the door open, I forced myself to look inside. I was honestly afraid someone was going to be in there, looking back at me. All the lights were off, but due to the streetlights outside, I could see pretty clearly. Inside the room, the bed was neatly made, as if waiting for a patient, but the cupboard doors had been left open. I looked up at the window, and that's when I realized the glass was covered in smudges and little handprints, as if a child had just been looking out the window and putting their hands all over the glass. This was on the 3rd or 4th floor, so I knew the handprints couldn't have come from the outside. It had to be someone inside that room. I turned around and walked as fast as I could to get out of there. I still had to pass 2 to 3 empty patient rooms to get to the exit, and I felt as if I was being watched at every doorway I passed. I knew that housekeeping had cleaned the windows many times since the ward had closed, so someone had left those handprints fairly recently. Because the old pediatric ward wasn't accessible to the public, it was extremely unlikely that a visitor, or their child, had stumbled upon that room. To this day, no one has been able to explain where the child-sized handprints came from, but other people have reported seeing them too, even after housekeeping washed the windows again. I'm still not convinced it was a ghost, but I can't explain what I saw either. The whole thing was odd, and it really scared some of my coworkers. I changed jobs several years ago, but I still hear rumors about that hospital being haunted. Hospital Ghoul, from Anonymous. This story happened with my grandmother about 15 years ago. My grandmother has been sick for pretty much her entire old age, and that required frequent visits to the hospital. As we were running out of money, we couldn't admit her to nice and high-tech hospitals anymore, so we decided to go ahead with a hospital nearby that had a decent reputation and an average team of doctors and nurses. The only problem it had was that the hospital was alleged to be haunted, as it had a morgue in its basement, and rumors had it that people who died in this hospital, their spirits would lurk around the entire hospital premises and haunt people. I was only 9 at the time and pretty afraid and paranoid about the entire situation. So I, by hook or crook, convinced my parents to arrange someone else to stay with my grandmother at night, as I did not want those nasty spirits to be anywhere around my parents. I know it sounds very selfish, but honestly, who could blame me? I was just looking out for them. My uncle, who's about 8 years younger than my dad, agreed to stay with her at night. Once they had settled in and night had already set, My uncle went to sleep early due to extreme fatigue from the activities in the day. My grandmother had fallen asleep, but woke up at 2 in the morning after hearing some weird noises and felt strange sensations at her feet. Now, my grandmother has had her fair share of paranormal and spooky incidents, so she was on edge at all times. Mustering up the courage, she opened up her eyes and looked directly in front of her. There, she saw a silhouette of a woman standing near her feet. This woman was as tall as one could imagine, with crazy long black hair and a strangely thin frame. The woman was sobbing at a very loud volume, enough to wake everyone up, but somehow my uncle seemed to be unaffected by this. My grandmother froze in place. She couldn't even lift up her finger or make a sound. It wasn't sleep paralysis, as this continued on until dawn, when the woman finally vanished into thin air. My poor grandmother had been with that spooky spirit for over 4 hours and couldn't do a thing. Not only that, but later in the day, my uncle saw a pool of blood under my grandmother's bed. Shocked, terrified, and worried, he ducked under the table to check for more. What he saw there made him scream like a little girl. Under the bed, there was more blood and a pair of scissors and an entire human tongue covered in blood. As quickly as my uncle and my sickly grandma could, they got out of that hospital and found a different hospital for her needs. We never went back there and would even avoid going near that hospital. I'm really glad that my grandmother was safe, and God knows what could have happened if that figure decided to attack her. My grandmother passed away last year in April at the age of 80. May she rest peacefully. Strange occurrences at the General Hospital. From Anonymous. This happened during the month of February in 2001. I now live in another country, and it happened many years past. My daughter is now a grown woman, but I still think about it often. The incident happened in an urban Michigan hospital. I had recently given birth to my daughter, and she began showing signs of jaundice a few days after coming home. She was admitted to the hospital, and I was staying in the room with her. 2 nights into our stay, I'd missed out on getting supper, as my daughter's tests had been scheduled during room service. The baby was under observation beneath the bilirubin lamp, so I went looking for a vending machine. I'd stayed in that hospital many times for extended periods, due to a previous long-term illness. I knew my way around it quite well. I remembered that there were a couple of vending machine courts in the oncology wing, so I started off in that direction. It was rather late at night, and that wing of the hospital was quite empty and dark. I didn't see another person whatsoever. As I walked, things became oddly quiet and close feeling. It seemed as though the corridor went on longer than it should have. There seemed to be more intersecting hallways than I remembered. I felt confused, but driven by hunger pangs, I sallied forth. After what seemed like forever, I came upon a well-lit vending machine area that I'd never seen before, and I thought that I knew that wing like the back of my hand. It was of the usual construction with a glass push-bar entry door. Behind that was a little alcove with vending machines, a small table, a trash receptacle, a large solarium window that looked out onto a little side street which ran parallel to the building, and a glass emergency exit door. I walked into the alcove and stood in front of the food vending machine. Inside of the machine, the product's packaging resembled familiar major name brand items, but the product and company names were off. I selected a bag of Delitos and sat down at the small table. I ate my packet of crisps while looking out at the night through the window. Through the tinted glass about 500 feet to the left, I could see the bright, busy ER entrance from where I was. I remember thinking to myself that there seemed to be more houses on that street than I'd remembered. I actually had a friend who lived on that street. I should have been able to see his house across the road, but the houses were unfamiliar in a nondescript way, and they stretched on further than I could see. I began to have a distinct, uncanny feeling that I didn't belong where I was and should leave that place. I got up, threw the empty crisps wrapper away, and went to the exit. I found that the door had locked behind me. On the wall beside the door I'd come in through was a phone box, so I used it to call the main desk via a marked preset button. The desk staff was absolutely confused when I relayed my location to them. They could not figure out where the heck I was. They rang security, who finally ended up having to briefly unlock every door in the hospital so that I could egress. "You have 10 seconds," the lady on the other end had said, so believe me, I booked it. I began walking briskly towards the ER entrance, and it seemed as though the distance stretched out longer as I was walking. When I got to the awning doors and looked back, there was no outer door, nor an alcove from whence I had just came. From where I stood, there was only a short span between the wing and the large attached clinic on the other side of it, which shared an outer wall. Upon entering, I went straight up to the triage desk, showed them my paper admittance bracelet, and told them what had happened. They were incredulous, but led me back through the main corridor. I unsteadily made my way back through the hospital to my daughter's room, and one of the nurses brought her back into me soon after. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. Thoughts of rooms that appeared and disappeared played out in my mind, over and over, and a lurking fear of my child being swallowed up into a non-existent place where she could never be found made me distrustful of allowing her to leave my sight again. I entertained the thought of mentioning my experience to one of the nurses, but I was afraid of being taken for a kook. I looked for that odd little alcove for days after, and every time I went to that hospital, but I never found it again. It still shakes me up to think about that night. I can't help but wonder if anyone else has had the same thing happen to them in that hospital, or if any of the staff who were present that evening could recount the same strange yarn from their own perspective. I often lie awake at night, recalling the events which transpired. I often scour the internet for any paranormal occurrences in that hospital, but so far, nothing has popped up. The Ghost of the Operating Room, from Mickey. My story takes place in a hospital. Both my parents worked in hospitals my entire life, and had numerous ghost stories that they would tell us from the many hospitals they worked in. I started working as a housekeeper at a hospital located in a small town. There, I began to experience my own paranormal experiences. I would see shadows of people walking in completely dark rooms, or hear voices in empty rooms. One time, I felt a small hand tugging at my jeans as if to get my attention. I told a coworker about this, and they told me that a few years prior, a 7-year-old girl had died in the room that I'd been in. I'm used to the paranormal. I grew up around it, and I wasn't really ever afraid of it. That was until one week in 2014. I worked the day shift during my time at the hospital, which was typically much busier than the night shift. My coworkers and I would rotate between areas, and this was the week that I would be mopping the operating room, OR, which included the recovery room and the office for the director of the OR. A small hallway connected the three together, which was a very calming experience. It would take about an hour or so, and most of the time I was the only one in the room. During this particular week, a family was staying in a room with their father, who had been admitted. Their room was on the hallway that I was in charge of. One important side note, I don't hold conversation very well, and back then it was even worse. I'd been cleaning the room for this family and their father when I had to go change out the gloves. I didn't communicate this with the family, and even though I came back to the room and finished cleaning, they accused me of skipping past their room entirely. They reported me to my manager and treated me like I was the scum of the earth. When the father was awake, he also participated in the bullying. Eventually, my manager pulled me from that hallway. I could still clean the OR, but I wouldn't deal with the family. The Saturday after they originally got there, I was scheduled to work with one other person. Saturdays were typically a bit slower, and I finished my normal cleaning by lunch. I decided to head into the OR after lunch, as they very rarely did operations on the weekend. The OR was in a hallway by itself that connected the patient rooms to the cafeteria. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, a sense of dread came over me. I pushed through it though, and filled up my mop bucket to head inside and mop. We had to mop the OR 3 times to make sure it was positively clean. During the first mop, my sense of dread kept growing, but I continued to mop until I got to the actual OR. There was a window that looked out at the hallway that connected the office and recovery room. While I was mopping the OR, I felt as though someone was watching me, but every time I looked, there was no one. I finished the first round and went to start the second. When I was about halfway done, I became scared and called my coworker who met me by the door. I told them I couldn't keep cleaning, as I was petrified. They agreed to take over as I was almost done anyway, and I left the room. The Monday afterwards, I went up to my manager and told them about what I experienced, and they went silent. When I questioned them on this, they told me that the family who had been bullying me had left early Saturday morning, after the father had passed away. My coworker, who had that Saturday off, had come in at about 3 a.m. to clean the room. She and my manager had agreed not to tell me for whatever reason. We both agreed that it might have been the father that had been in the OR with me. I'd never feared cleaning the OR before that experience, and I never felt afraid after that day. It was only that one day after the father had died. About a year after this experience, the hospital was closed, and now it sits abandoned. I do not miss the job or the spirits I encountered during my time there. The Trapped Spirit. From Merritt. It was a chilly early morning. My spouse had a doctor's appointment and was called in by the nurse. In the meantime, I waited in the waiting room. I noticed I was the only one there, which seemed odd as it's usually quite busy in the morning. But this was different. Behind me there was glass, so I could see what was going on in the hallway, where the CT scan and MRIs took place. It was a separate section, attached to the hospital on the other side. All of a sudden, the lights in the CT scan room started flickering, but there was no one in there. I didn't think too much of it. I mean, it could have just been a malfunction, right? I tried to pay it no mind, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a figure coming out of the room. There was no face on it, just a very dark figure. This startled me. The aura and vibe from this figure seemed angry and scared. When it went past me, I peeked around the corner, and at the very end of the building there were no doors, at least none in use. There used to be a door there before, but it had been turned into a wall and was painted. The figure disappeared into that very wall. I was uncomfortable at this point, hoping my spouse would come back so we could get the heck out of there. I got on my phone and tried to listen to some music to calm myself down. I didn't want to go crazy and become a patient. The moment I began a video, there was a loud banging coming from where the door used to be. It was so loud, I thought the wall was going to fall down. I tried to tune it out, but I began to feel sad. It felt as if the figure who I saw was telling me he or she was trapped there and could not get out of the hospital. All of a sudden, From the other side of the building, which is where we arrived to the office, an old lady in her late 90s walked up to me and said,
"You saw him, didn't you?"
She told me of a story of a man who died here when this part of the hospital was still active. He was all alone, and now apparently his spirit is stuck in the building. My heart shattered. The woman explained, this man fell into a severe depression due to the sad fact he had no family or friends. He wanted to escape the horror he was going through. He was hospitalized due to an issue with his heart. The man had been in his late 80s. When he was about to die, he asked to be outside when it happened, but the nurses refused his request. He got really angry. After all, he had one wish and was denied. Later on, he was found dead outside of his hospital bed, trying to reach the door. When I heard this, I felt a cold wind come over me. I was quite scared, but more sad. As soon as the lady was finished with her story, my spouse came out of the office. I turned back to where the lady had been standing, and she was gone. There was no way a lady of her age could have went through a hallway so quickly without me seeing her in the middle or end of the hallway. I never found out this man's name, nor the woman's, so I was unable to do more research. Before we left the office, I looked back to where the door used to be, and I said, "Call out for God. He'll help you find the peace you seek." The next time we came back to the office, the nurses were in better moods and couldn't explain why. And to me, the place felt more peaceful. It was as if the man had moved on to where he wanted to be. This made me smile. Having an encounter with the spirit isn't always a bad thing. It can also be a good learning experience, and a moment which might be memorized forever. Thanks for listening to Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed the show, you can support us in a number of other ways. You can go to eeriecast.store to buy some creepy t-shirts or coffee mugs. Go to eeriecast.com to listen to and follow this show and our other scary podcasts on your favorite podcasting app, or follow me on Twitter @DarkPrevails for more screams and memes. Before I go, be sure to send me your scariest stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.